D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, Chapter 12. Connie went to the wood directly after lunch. It was really a lovely day. The first dandelions making suns, the first daisies so white. The hazel thicket was a lacework of half-open leaves, and the last dusty perpendicular of the catkins. Yellow celandines now were in crowds, flat, open, pressed back in urgency, and the yellow glitter of themselves. It was the yellow, the powerful yellow of early summer. And the primroses were broad, and the full pale of abandon, thick clustered primroses no longer shy. The lush, dark green of the hyacinths was a sea, with buds rising like pale corn, while in the riding the forget-me-nots were fluffing up, and columbines were unfolding their ink-purple rushes. And there were bits of bluebird's eggshell under a bush. Everywhere the bud knots and the leap of life. The keeper was not at the hut. Everything was serene, brown chickens running lustily. Connie walked on towards the cottage because she wanted to find him. The cottage stood in the sun off the wood's edge. In the little garden the double daffodils rose in tufts near the wide open door, and red double daisies made a border to the path. There was the bark of a dog, and Flossie came running. The wide open door, so he was at home. And the sunlight falling on the red brick floor. As she went up the path, she saw him through the window, sitting at the table in his shirt sleeves, eating. The dog woofed softly, slowly wagging her tail. He rose and came to the door, wiping his mouth with a red handkerchief, still chewing. "May I come in?" she said. "Come in." The sun shone into the bare room, which still smelled of a mutton chop done in a Dutch oven before the fire, because the Dutch oven stood still on the fender with the black potato saucepan on a piece of paper beside it on the white hearth. The fire was red, rather low, the bar dropped, the kettle singing. On the table was his plate, with potatoes and the remains of the chop, also bread in a basket, salt, and a blue mug with beer. The tablecloth was white oilcloth. He stood in the shade. "You are very late," she said. "Do go on eating." She sat down on a wooden chair in the sunlight by the door. "I had to go to Youthwaite," he said, sitting down at the table but not eating. "Do eat," she said. But he did not touch the food. "Shall you have something?" he asked her. "Shall you have a cup of tea? The kettle's on to boil." He half rose again from his chair. "If you'll let me make it myself," she said, rising. He seemed sad, and she felt she was bothering him. "Well, teapot's in there." He pointed to a little drab corner cupboard, "and cops, and tea's on t' mantel over your head. She got the black teapot and the tin of tea from the mantel shelf. She rinsed the teapot with hot water and stood a moment wondering where to empty it. "Throw it out," he said, aware of her. "It's clean." She went to the door and threw the drop of water down the path. How lovely it was here, so still, so really woodland. The oaks were putting out ochre-yellow leaves. In the garden the red daisies were like red plush buttons. She glanced at the big, hollow sandstone slab at the threshold, now crossed by so few feet. "But it's lovely here," she said. "Such a beautiful stillness. Everything alive and still." He was eating again, rather slowly and unwillingly, and she could feel he was discouraged. She made the tea in silence and set the teapot on the hob, as she knew the people did. He pushed his plate aside and went to the back place. She heard a latch click, and then he came back with cheese on a plate and butter. She set the 2 cups on the table. There were only 2. "Will you have a cup of tea?" she said. "If you like. Sugar's in the cupboard. And there's a little cream jug. Milk in a jug in the pantry." "Shall I take your plate away?" she asked him. He looked up at her with a faint, ironical smile. "Why, if you like," he said, slowly eating bread and cheese. She went to the back, into the penthouse scullery where the pump was. On the left was a door, no doubt the pantry door. She unlatched it and almost smiled at the place he called a pantry, a long, narrow, whitewashed slip of a cupboard. But it managed to contain a little barrel of beer, as well as a few dishes and bits of food. She took a little milk from the yellow jug. "How do you get your milk?" she asked him when she came back to the table. "Flint's. They leave me a bottle at the Warren end. You know, where I met you." But he was discouraged. She poured out the tea, poising the cream jug. "No milk," he said. Then he seemed to hear a noise and looked keenly through the doorway. "'Atten we'd better shut," he said. "It seems a pity," she replied. "Nobody will come, will they?" "Not unless it's one time in 1,000, but you never know." "And even then it's no matter," she said. "It's only a cup of tea." "Where are the spoons?" He reached over and pulled down the table drawer. Connie sat at the table in the sunshine of the doorway. "Flossie," he said to the dog, who was lying on a little mat at the stair-foot. "Go and hark, hark." He lifted his finger, and his hark was very vivid. The dog trotted out to reconnoiter. "Are you sad today?" she asked him. He turned his blue eyes quickly and gazed direct on her. "Sad? No. Bored. I had to go getting summonses for 2 poachers I caught. And well, I don't like people." He spoke cold, good English, and there was anger in his voice. "Do you hate being a gamekeeper?" she asked. "Being a gamekeeper? No, so long as I'm left alone. But when I have to go messing around at the police station and various other places and waiting for a lot of fools to attend to me, oh, well, I get mad." And he smiled with a certain faint humor. "Couldn't you be really independent?" she asked. "Me? I suppose I could, if you mean manage to exist on my pension. I could. But I've got to work, or I should die. That is, I've got to have something that keeps me occupied, and I'm not in a good enough temper to work for myself. It's got to be a sort of job for somebody else, or I should throw it up in a month, out of bad temper. So, altogether, I'm very well off here, especially lately." He laughed at her again with mocking humor. "But why are you in a bad temper?" she asked. "Do you mean you are always in a bad temper?" "Pretty well," he said, laughing. "I don't quite digest my bile." "But what bile?" she said. "Bile," he said. "Don't you know what that is?" She was silent and disappointed. He was taking no notice of her. "I'm going away for a while next month," she said. "You are? Where to?" "Venice. With Sir Clifford? For how long?" "For a month or so," she replied. "Clifford won't go." "He'll stay here?" he asked. "Yes, he hates to travel as he is." "Aye, poor devil," he said, with sympathy. There was a pause. "You won't forget me when I'm gone, will you?" she asked. Again he lifted his eyes and looked full at her. "Forget," he said. "You know nobody forgets. It's not a question of memory." She wanted to say, "What then?" but she didn't. Instead, she said in a mute kind of voice, "I told Clifford I might have a child." Now he really looked at her, intense and searching. "You did," he said at last. "And what did he say?" "Oh, he wouldn't mind. He'd be glad, really, so long as it seemed to be his." She dared not look up at him. He was silent a long time. Then he gazed again on her face. "No mention of me, of course," he said. "No, no mention of you," she said. "No, he'd hardly swallow me as a substitute breeder. Then where are you supposed to be getting the child?" "I might have a love affair in Venice," she said. "You might," he replied slowly. "So that's why you're going?" "Not to have the love affair," she said, looking up at him, pleading. "Just the appearance of one," he said. There was silence. He sat staring out the window with a faint grin, half mockery, half bitterness on his face. She hated his grin. "You've not taken any precautions against having a child, then?" he asked her suddenly. "Because I haven't." "No," she said faintly. "I should hate that." He looked at her, then again with the peculiar subtle grin out of the window. There was a tense silence. At last he turned his head and said satirically, "That was why you wanted me, then, to get a child?" She hung her head. "No, not really," she said. "What then, really?" he asked rather bitingly. She looked up at him reproachfully, saying, "I don't know." He broke into a laugh. "Then I'm damned if I do," he said. There was a long pause of silence, a cold silence. "Well," he said at last. "It's as your ladyship likes. If you get the baby, Sir Clifford's welcome to it. I shan't have lost anything. On the contrary, I've had a very nice experience, very nice indeed." And he stretched in a half-suppressed sort of yawn. "If you've made use of me," he said, "it's not the first time I've been made use of, and I don't suppose it's ever been as pleasant as this time, though of course one can't feel tremendously dignified about it." He stretched again, curiously, his muscles quivering and his jaw oddly set. "But I didn't make use of you," she said, pleading. "At your ladyship's service," he replied. "No," she said. "I liked your body." "Did you?" he replied, and he laughed. "Well, then, we are quits, because I liked yours." He looked at her with queer, darkened eyes. "Would you like to go upstairs now?" he asked her in a strangled sort of voice. "No, not here, not now," she said heavily, though if he had used any power over her she would have gone, for she had no strength against him. He turned his face away again and seemed to forget her. "I want to touch you like you touch me," she said. "I've never really touched your body." He looked at her and smiled again. "Now?" he said. No, not here. At the hut. Would you mind?" "How do I touch you?" he asked. "When you feel me." He looked at her and met her heavy, anxious eyes. "And do you like it when I feel you?" he asked, laughing at her still. "Yes." "Do you?" she said. "Oh, me!" Then he changed his tone. "Yes," he said. "You know without asking," which was true. She rose and picked up her hat. "I must go," she said. "Will you go?" he replied politely. She wanted him to touch her, to say something to her, but he said nothing, only waited politely. "Thank you for the tea," she said. "I haven't thanked your ladyship for doing me the honours of my teapot," he said. She went down the path, and he stood in the doorway, faintly grinning. Flossie came running with her tail lifted, and Connie had to plod dumbly across into the wood, knowing he was standing there watching her, with that incomprehensible grin on his face. She walked home very much downcast and annoyed. She didn't at all like his saying he had been made use of, because, in a sense, it was true. But he oughtn't to have said it. Therefore, again, she was divided between two feelings, resentment against him and a desire to make it up with him. She passed a very uneasy and irritated tea time, and at once went up to her room. But when she was there, it was no good. She could neither sit nor stand. She would have to do something about it. She would have to go back to the hut. If he was not there, well and good. She slipped out the side door and took her way direct and a little sullen. When she came to the clearing, she was terribly uneasy, but there he was again in his shirt-sleeves, stooping, letting the hens out of the coops, among the chicks that were now growing a little gawky, but were much more trim than the hen chickens. She went straight across to him. "You see, I've come," she said. I see it," he said, straightening his back and looking at her with a faint amusement. Do you let the hens out now? She asked. Yes, they've sat themselves to skin and bone, he said, and now they're not at all that anxious to come out and feed. There's no self in a sitting hen. She's all in the eggs or the chicks. Poor mother hens, such blind devotion, even to eggs not their own. Connie looked at them in compassion. A helpless silence fell between the man and the woman. Shall us go in the hut? He asked. Do you want me? She asked in a sort of mistrust. Aye, if you want to come. She was silent. Come then, he said. And she went with him to the hut. It was quite dark when he had shut the door, so he made a small light in the lantern as before. Have you left your underthings off? He asked her. Yes. Aye, well, then I'll take my things off too. He spread the blankets, putting one at the side for a coverlet. She took off her hat and shook her hair. He sat down, taking off his shoes and gaiters, and undoing his cord breeches. Lie down then, he said, when he stood in his shirt. She obeyed in silence, and he lay beside her and pulled the blanket over them both. There, he said. And he lifted her dress right back till he came even to her breasts. He kissed them softly, taking the nipples in his lips in tiny caresses. Eh, but thou'rt nice, he said, suddenly rubbing his face with a snuggling movement against her warm belly. And she put her arms around him under his shirt, but she was afraid of his thin, smooth, naked body that seemed so powerful, afraid of the violent muscles. She shrank, afraid. And when he said with a sort of little sigh, Eh, thou'rt nice, something in her quivered, and something in her spirit stiffened in resistance, stiffened from the terribly physical intimacy and from the peculiar haste of his possession. And this time the sharp ecstasy of her own passion did not overcome her. She lay with her ends inert on his striving body, and do what she might, her spirit seemed to look on him from the top of her head, and the butting of his haunches seemed ridiculous to her, and the sort of anxiety of his penis to come to its little evacuating crisis seemed farcical. Yes, this was love, this ridiculous bouncing of the buttocks and the wilting of the poor, insignificant, moist little penis. This was the divine love. After all, the moderns were right when they felt contempt for the performance, for it was a performance. It was quite true, as some poets said, that the God who created man must have had a sinister sense of humor, creating him a reasonable being, yet forcing him to take this ridiculous posture and driving him with blind craving for this ridiculous performance. Even a Maupassant found it a humiliating anticlimax. Men despised the intercourse act, and yet did it. Cold and derisive, her queer female mind stood apart, and though she lay perfectly still, her impulse was to heave her loins and throw the man out, escape his ugly grip and the butting overriding of his absurd haunches. His body was a foolish, impudent, imperfect thing, a little disgusting in its unfinished clumsiness, For surely a complete evolution would eliminate this performance, this function. And yet, when he had finished, soon over, and lay very, very still, receding into silence and a strange, motionless distance, far, farther than the horizon of her awareness, her heart began to weep. She could feel him ebbing away, leaving her there like a stone on a shore. He was withdrawing. His spirit was leaving her. He knew. And in real grief, tormented by her own double consciousness and reaction, she began to weep. He took no notice, or did not even know. The storm of weeping swelled and shook her, and shook him. Aye, he said, it was no good that time. He wasn't there. So he knew. Her sobs became violent. But what's amiss, he said. It's once in a while that way. I can't love you, she sobbed, suddenly feeling her heart breaking. Can't you? Oh, dunna fret. There's no law says as there's got to. Take it for what it is. He still lay with his hand on her breast, but she had drawn both her hands from him. His words were small comfort. She sobbed aloud. Nay, nay, he said, take the thick with the thin. This were a bit o' thin for once. She wept bitterly, sobbing. But I want to love you, and I can't. It only seems horrid. He laughed a little, half bitter, half amused. It isna horrid, he said, even if thou thinks it is, and thou canna make it horrid. Dinna fret thyself about loving me. Thou'lt never force thyself to it. There's sure to be a bad nut in the basketful. Thou mun take the rough with the smooth. He took his hand away from her breast, not touching her. And now she was untouched. She took an almost perverse satisfaction in it. She hated the dialect, the thee and the thou and the thysen. He could get up if he liked and stand there above her, buttoning down those absurd corduroy breeches straight in front of her. After all, Michaelis had had the decency to turn away. This man was so assured in himself he didn't know what a clown other people found him, a half-bred fellow. Yet, as he was drawing away, to rise silently and leave her, she clung to him in terror. Don't go, don't leave me, don't be cross with me, hold me fast, she whispered in blind frenzy, not even knowing what she said, and clinging to him with uncanny force. It was from herself she wanted to be saved, from her own inward anger and resistance. Yet how powerful was that inward resistance that possessed her? He took her in his arms again and drew her to him, and suddenly she became small in his arms, small and nestling. It was gone. The resistance was gone, and she began to melt in a marvelous peace. And as she melted small and wonderful in his arms, she became infinitely desirable to him. All his blood vessels seemed to scald with intense yet tender desire for her softness, for the penetrating beauty of her in his arms, passing into his blood. and softly with that marvelous swoon-like caress of his hand in pure, soft desire, softly he stroked the silky slope of her loins, down between her soft, warm buttocks, coming nearer and nearer to the very quick of her. And she felt him like a flame of desire, yet tender, and she felt herself melting in the flame. She let herself go. She felt his penis risen against her with silent, amazing force and assertion, and she let herself go to him. She yielded with a quiver that was like death. She went all open to him, and oh, if he were not tender to her now, how cruel, for she was all open to him and helpless. She quivered again at the potent, inexorable entry inside her, so strange and terrible. It might come with the thrust of a sword in her softly opened body, and that would be death. She clung in a sudden anguish of terror, but it came with a strange, slow thrust of peace, the dark thrust of peace, and a ponderous primordial tenderness, such as made the world in the beginning. And her terror subsided in her breast. Her breast dared to be gone in peace. She held nothing. She dared to let go everything, all herself, and be gone in the flood. And it seemed she was like the sea, nothing but dark waves rising and heaving with a great swell, so that slowly her whole darkness was in motion, and she was ocean rolling its dark, dumb mass. Oh, and far down inside her the deeps parted and rolled asunder in long, fair, traveling billows, and ever at the quick of her the depths parted and rolled asunder from the center of soft plunging, as the plunger went deeper and deeper, touching lower, and she was deeper and deeper and deeper disclosed. The heavier the billows of her rolled away to some shore, uncovering her, and closer plunged the palpable unknown. And further rolled the waves of herself away from herself, leaving her, till suddenly, in a soft, shuddering convulsion, the quick of all her plasm was touched. She knew herself touched. The consummation was upon her, and she was gone. She was gone. She was not, and she was born a woman. Ah, too lovely, too lovely. In the ebbing she realized all the loveliness. Now all her body clung with tender love to the unknown man, and blindly to the wilting penis, as it so tenderly, frailly, unknowingly withdrew after the fierce thrust of its potency. As it drew out and left her body, the secret, sensitive thing, she gave an unconscious cry of pure loss, and she tried to put it back. It had been so perfect, and she loved it so. And only now she became aware of the small bud-like reticence and tenderness of the penis, and a little cry of wonder and poignancy escaped her again, her woman's heart crying out over the tender frailty of that which had been the power. "It was so lovely," she moaned. "It was so lovely." But he said nothing, only softly kissed her, lying still above her, and she moaned with a sort of bliss, as a sacrifice, and a newborn thing. And now in her heart the queer wonder of him was awakened. A man, the strange potency of manhood upon her. Her hands strayed over him, still a little afraid of that strange, hostile, slightly repulsive thing that he had been to her. A man. And now she touched him, and it was the sons of God with the daughters of men. How beautiful he felt, how pure in tissue. How lovely, strong, and yet pure and delicate, such stillness of the sensitive body, such utter stillness of potency and delicate flesh. How beautiful, how beautiful. Her hands came timorously down his back to the soft, smallish globes of the buttocks. Beauty. What beauty. A sudden little flame of new awareness went through her. How was it possible, this beauty here where she had previously only been repelled? The unspeakable beauty to the touch of the warm, living buttocks, the life within life, the sheer, warm, potent loveliness, and the strange weight of the balls between his legs. What a mystery! What a strange, heavy weight of mystery that could lie soft and heavy in one's hand. The root of all that is lovely, the primeval root of all full beauty. She clung to him with a hiss of wonder that was almost awe, terror. He held her close, but he said nothing. He would never say anything. She crept nearer to him, nearer only to be near to the sensual wonder of him. And out of this utter, incomprehensible stillness, she felt again the slow, momentous, surging rise of the phallus again, the other power, and her heart melted out with a kind of awe. And this time his being within her was all soft and iridescent, purely soft and iridescent, such as no consciousness could seize. Her whole self quivered unconscious and alive like plasm. She could not know what it was. She could not remember what it had been, only that it had been more lovely than anything ever could be. Only that. And afterwards she was utterly still, utterly unknowing. She was not aware for how long. And he was still with her, in an unfathomable silence along with her, and of this they would never speak. When awareness of the outside began to come back, she clung to his breast, murmuring, "My love, my love, my love, my love." And he held her silently, and she curled on his breast. Perfect. But his silence was fathomless. His hands held her like flowers, so still and strange. "Where are you?" she whispered to him. "Where are you? Speak to me, say something to me." He kissed her softly, murmuring, "Ay, my lass." But she did not know what he meant. She did not know where he was. In his silence he seemed lost to her. You love me, don't you? She murmured. Aye, thou knows, he said. But tell me, she pleaded. Aye, hasn't you felt it, he said dimly, but softly and surely. And she clung close to him, closer. He was so much more peaceful in love than she was, and she wanted him to reassure her. You do love me, she whispered, assertive. And his hands stroked her softly, as if she were a flower, without the quiver of desire, but with delicate nearness. And still there haunted her a restless necessity to get a grip on love. Say you'll always love me, she pleaded. Aye, he said abstractedly, and she felt her questions driving him away from her. Mustn't we get up, he said at last. No, she said. But she could feel his consciousness straying, listening to the noises outside. It'll be nearly dark, he said, and she heard the pressure of circumstances in his voice. She kissed him with a woman's grief at yielding up her hour. He rose and turned up the lantern, then began to pull on his clothes, quickly disappearing inside them. Then he stood there above her, fastening his breeches and looking down at her with dark, wide eyes, his face a little flushed and his hair ruffled, curiously warm and still beautiful in the dim light of the lantern. So beautiful, she would never tell him how beautiful. It made her want to cling fast to him, to hold him, for there was a warm, half-sleepy remoteness in his beauty that made her want to cry out and clutch him, to have him. She would never have him. So she lay on the blanket with curved, soft, naked haunches, and he had no idea what she was thinking. But to him, too, she was beautiful, the soft, marvelous thing he could go into beyond everything. I love thee that I call go into thee, he said. Do you like me? She said, her heart beating. It heals it all up that I can go into thee. I love thee that the opened to me. I love thee that I came into thee like that. He bent down and kissed her soft flank, rubbed his cheek against it, then covered it up. And will you never leave me, she said. Dunna ask them things, he said. But you do believe I love you, she said. Thou loved me just now wider than I've ever thought that thou would. But who knows what'll happen once thou starts thinking about it. No, don't say those things. And you don't really think that I wanted to make use of you, do you? How? To have a child? Now anybody can have any child in the world, he said, as he sat down, fastening on his leggings. Ah, no, she cried. You don't mean it. Well, he said, looking at her under his brows. This wort best. She lay still. He softly opened the door. The sky was dark blue with crystalline turquoise rim. He went out to shut up the hens, speaking softly to his dog. And she lay and wondered at the wonder of life and of being. When he came back, she was still lying there, glowing like a gypsy. He sat on the stool by her. "The mun come one night to the cottage afore the goes, Shulter?" he asked, lifting his eyebrows as he looked at her, his hands dangling between his knees. "Shulter?" she echoed, teasing. He smiled. "Aye, Shulter," he he repeated. Aye, she said, imitating the dialect sound. Yea, he said. Yea, she repeated. And sleep with me, he said. It needs that. When shall't come? When shall I, she said. Nay, he said, thou canna do it. When shall't come, then? Happen Sunday, she said. Happen a Sunday, aye. He laughed at her quickly. Nay, thou canna, he protested. Why canna I? She said. D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, Chapter 13. On Sunday, Clifford wanted to go into the wood. It was a lovely morning. The pear blossom and plum had suddenly appeared in the world in a wonder of white here and there. It was cruel for Clifford, while the world bloomed, to have to be helped from the chair to bath chair, but he had forgotten, and even seemed to have a certain conceit of himself in his lameness. Connie still suffered, having to lift his inert legs into place. Mrs. Bolton did it now. Or Field. She waited for him at the top of the drive, at the edge of the screen of beeches. His chair came puffing along with a sort of valetudinarian slow importance. As he joined his wife, he said, Sir Clifford on his roaming steed. Snorting, at least, she laughed. He stopped and looked round at the facade of the long, low, old brown house. Ragby doesn't wink an eyelid, he said, but then why should it? I ride upon the achievements of the mind of man, and that beats a horse. I suppose it does, and the souls in Plato riding up to heaven in a 2-horse chariot would go in a Ford car now, she said, or a Rolls-Royce. Plato was an aristocrat. Quite. No more black horse to thrash and maltreat. Plato never thought we'd go one better than his black steed and his white steed, and have no steeds at all, only an engine. Only an engine and gas, said Clifford. I hope I can have some repairs done to the old place next year. I think I shall have about 1,000 to spare for that. But work costs so much, he added. Oh, good, said Connie. If only there aren't more strikes. What would be the use of their striking again? Merely ruin the industry, what's left of it, and surely the owls are beginning to see it. Perhaps they don't mind ruining the industry, said Connie. Ah, don't talk like a woman. The industry fills their bellies, even if it can't keep their pockets quite so flush, he said, using turns of speech that oddly had a twang of Mrs. Bolton. But didn't you say the other day that you were a conservative anarchist? She asked innocently. And didn't you understand what I meant? He retorted. All I meant is people can be what they like, and feel what they like, and do what they like, strictly, privately, so long as they keep the form of life intact, and the apparatus. Connie walked on in silence a few paces. Then she said obstinately, It sounds like saying an egg may go as addled as it likes, so long as it keeps its shell on whole. But addled eggs do break of themselves. I don't think people are eggs, he said, not even angels' eggs, my dear little evangelist. He was in rather high feather this bright morning. The larks were trilling away over the park. The distant pit in the hollow was fuming silent steam. It was almost like old days before the war. Connie didn't really want to argue, but then she did not really want to go to the wood with Clifford either. So she walked beside his chair in a certain obstinacy of spirit. No, he said, there will be no more strikes. If the thing is properly managed. Why not? Because the strikes will be made good as impossible. But will the men let you? We shan't ask them. We shall do it while they aren't looking, for their own good, to save the industry. For your own good, too, she said. Naturally, for the good of everybody, but for their own good even more than mine. I can live without the pits. They can't. They'll starve if there are no pits. I've got other provision. They looked up the shallow valley at the mine, and beyond it at the black-lidded houses of Tevershall, crawling like some serpent up the hill. From the old brown church the bells were ringing. Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. But will the men let you dictate terms, she said. My dear, they will have to, if one does it gently. But mightn't there be a mutual understanding? Absolutely, when they realize that the industry comes before the individual. But must you own the industry, she said. I don't. But to the extent I do own it, yes, most decidedly. The ownership of property has now become a religious question, as it has been since Jesus and St. Francis. The point is not take all thou hast and give it to the poor, but use all thou hast to encourage the industry and give work to the poor. It's the only way to feed all the mouths and clothe all the bodies. Giving away all we have to the poor spells starvation for the poor just as much as for us. And universal starvation is no high aim. Even general poverty is no lovely thing. Poverty is ugly. But the disparity, that is fate. Why is the star Jupiter bigger than the star Neptune? You can't start altering the makeup of things. But when this envy and jealousy and discontent has once started, she began, do your best to stop it. Somebody's got to be boss of the show. But who is boss of the show, she asked. The men who own and run the industries. There was a long silence. It seems to me they're a bad boss, she said. Then you suggest what they should do. They don't take their boss-ship seriously enough, she said. They take it far more seriously than you take your ladyship, he said. That's thrust upon me. I don't really want it, she blurted out. He stopped the chair and looked at her. Who's shirking their responsibility now, he said. Who is trying to get away now from the responsibility of their own boss-ship, as you call it? But I don't want my boss-ship, she protested. Ah, but that is funk. You've got it, fated to it, and you should live up to it. Who has given all the colliers all they have that's worth having, all their political liberty and their education such as it is, their sanitation, their health conditions, their books, their music, everything? Who has given it to them? Have colliers given it to colliers? No. All the Ragbys and Shipleys in England have given their part, and must go on giving. There's your responsibility. Connie listened and flushed very red. I'd like to give something, she said, but I'm not allowed. Everything is to be sold and paid for now, and all the things you mention now, Ragby and Shipley, sells them to the people at a good profit. Everything is sold. You don't give one heartbeat of real sympathy. And besides, who has taken away from the people their natural life and manhood, and given them this industrial horror? Who has done that? And what must I do, he asked, green? Ask them to come and pillage me? Why is Tevershall so ugly, so hideous? Why are their lives so hopeless? They built their own Tevershall. That's part of their display of freedom. They built themselves their pretty Tevershall, and they live their own pretty lives. I can't live their lives for them. Every beetle must live its own life. But you make them work for you. They live the life of your coal mine. Not at all. Every beetle finds its own food. Not one man is forced to work for me. Their lives are industrialized and hopeless, and so are ours, she cried. I don't think they are. That's just a romantic figure of speech, a relic of the swooning and die-away romanticism. You don't look at all a hopeless figure standing there, Connie, my dear. Which was true, for her dark blue eyes were flashing. Her color was hot in her cheeks. She looked full of a rebellious passion far from the dejection of hopelessness. She noticed ill the tussocky places of the grass, cottony young cowslips standing up still bleared in their down, and she wondered with rage why it was she felt Clifford was so wrong, yet she couldn't say to him, she could not say exactly where he was wrong. No wonder the men hate you, she said. They don't, he replied, and don't fall into errors. In your sense of the word, they are not men. They are animals, don't you understand? And never could. Don't thrust your illusions on other people. The masses were always the same, and always will be the same. And will always be the same. Nero's slaves were extremely little different from our colliers, or the Ford motor car workmen. I mean, Nero's mine slaves and his field slaves. It is the masses. They are unchangeable. An individual may emerge from the masses, but the emergence doesn't alter the mass. The masses are unalterable. It is one of the most momentous facts of social science. Panem et circenses. Only today, education is one of the bad substitutes for a circus. What is wrong today is that we've made a profound hash of the circus's part of the program and poisoned our masses with a little education. When Clifford became really roused in his feelings about the common people, Connie was frightened. There was something devastatingly true in what he said, but it was a truth that killed. Seeing her pale and silent, Clifford started the chair again, and no more was said till he halted again at the wood gate, which she opened. "And what we need to take up now," he said, "is whips, not swords. The masses have been ruled since time began, and till time ends, ruled they will have to be. It is sheer hypocrisy and farce to say they can rule themselves." "But can you rule them?" she asked. "I? Oh, yes. Neither my mind nor my will is crippled, and I don't rule with my legs. I can do my share of ruling, absolutely my share, and give me a son, and he will be able to rule his portion after me." "But he wouldn't be your own son, of your own ruling class. Or perhaps not," she stammered. "I don't care who his father may be, so long as he is a healthy man, not below normal intelligence. Give me the child of any healthy, normally intelligent man, and I will make a perfectly competent Chatterley of him. It is not who begets us that matters, but where fate places us. Place any child among the ruling classes, and he will grow up, to his own extent, a ruler. Put kings' and dukes' children among the masses, and they'll be little plebeians, mass products. It is the overwhelming pressure of environment. Then the common people aren't a race, and the aristocrats aren't blood," she said. "No, my child, all that is romantic illusion. Aristocracy is a function, a part of fate. And the masses are another functioning of another part of fate. The individual hardly matters. It is a question of which function you are brought up to and adapted to. It is not the individuals that make an aristocracy. It is the functioning of the aristocratic whole. And it is the functioning of the whole mass that makes the common man what he is. Then there is no common humanity between us all. Just as you like, we all need to fill our bellies, but when it comes to expressive or executive functioning, I believe there is a gulf, and an absolute one, between the ruling and the serving classes. The two functions are opposed, and the function determines the individual. Connie looked at him with dazed eyes. "Won't you come on?" she said. And he started his chair. He had said his say. Now he lapsed into his peculiar and rather vacant apathy that Connie found so trying. In the wood, anyhow, she was determined not to argue. In front of them ran the open cleft of the riding, between the hazel walls and the gay gray trees. The chair puffed slowly on, slowly surging into the forget-me-nots that rose up in the drive like milk froth beyond the hazel shadows. Clifford steered the middle course where feet-passing had kept a channel through the flowers, but Connie, walking behind, had watched the wheels jolt over the wood rough and the bugle and squash the little yellow cups of the creeping jenny. Now they made a wake through the forget-me-nots. All the flowers were there, the first bluebells in blue pools like standing water. "You're quite right about its being beautiful," said Clifford. "It is so amazingly. What is quite so lovely as an English spring." Connie thought it sounded as if even the spring bloomed by act of Parliament. An English spring. Why not an Irish one, or Jewish? The chair moved slowly ahead, past tufts of sturdy bluebells that stood up like wheat, and over gray burdock leaves. When they came to the open place where the trees had been felled, the light flooded in rather stark, and the bluebells made sheets of bright blue color here and there, shearing off into lilac and purple. And between, the bracken was lifting its brown curled heads like legions of young snakes with a new secret to whisper to Eve. Clifford kept the chair going till he came to the brow of the hill. Connie followed slowly behind. The oak buds were opening soft and brown. Everything came tenderly out of the old hardness. Even the snaggy, craggy oak trees put out the softest young leaves, spreading thin brown little wings like young bat wings in the light. Why had men never any newness in them, any freshness to come forth with? Stale men. Clifford stopped the chair at the top of the rise and looked down. The bluebells washed blue like floodwater over the broad riding and lit up the downhill with a warm blueness. "It's a very fine color in itself," said Clifford, "but useless for making a painting." "Quite," said Connie, completely uninterested. "Shall I venture as far as the spring?" said Clifford. "Will the chair get up again?" she said. "We'll try. Nothing ventured, nothing win." And the chair began to advance, slowly, joltingly, down the beautiful broad riding washed over with blue encroaching hyacinths. O last of all ships through the hyacinthine shallows! O pinnacle on the last wild waters, sailing in the last voyage of our civilization! Whither, O weird wheeled ship, your slow course steering, quiet and complacent, Clifford sat at the wheel of adventure, in his old black hat and tweed jacket, motionless and cautious. O Captain, my Captain, our splendid trip is done. Not yet, though. Downhill in the wake, came Constance in her grey dress, watching the chair jolt downwards. They passed the narrow track to the hut. Thank heaven it was not wide enough for the chair, hardly wide enough for one person. The chair reached the bottom of the slope and swerved around to disappear, and Connie heard a low whistle behind her. She glanced sharply round. The keeper was striding downhill towards her, his dog keeping behind him. "Is Sir Clifford going to the cottage?" he asked, looking into her eyes. "No, only to the well." "Ah, good. Then I can keep out of sight. But I shall see you tonight. I shall wait for you at the park gate about 10. He looked again direct into her eyes. "Yes," she faltered. They heard the pap, pap of Clifford's horn tooting for Connie. She cooed in reply. The keeper's face flickered with a little grimace, and with his hand he softly brushed her breast upwards from underneath. She looked at him, frightened, and started running down the hill, calling "Coo-wee" again to Clifford. The man above watched her, then turned, grinning faintly, back into his path. She found Clifford slowly mounting to the spring, which was halfway up the slope of the dark larch wood. He was there by the time she caught him up. "She did that all right," he said, referring to the chair. Connie looked at the great grey leaves of burdock that grew out ghostly from the edge of the larch wood. The people call it Robin Hood's rhubarb. How silent and gloomy it seemed by the well, yet the water bubbled so bright. Wonderful. And there were bits of eyebright and strong blue bugle. And there, under the bank, the yellow earth was moving. A mole. It emerged, rowing its pink hands and waving its blind gimlet of a face with the tiny pink nose-tip uplifted. "It seems to see with the end of its nose," said Connie. "Better than with its eyes," he said. "Will you drink?" "Will you?" She took an enamel mug from a twig on a tree and stooped to fill it for him. He drank in sips. Then she stooped again and drank a little herself. "So icy," she said, gasping. "Good, isn't it? Did you wish?" "Did you?" "Yes, I wished, but I won't tell." She was aware of the rapping of a woodpecker, then of the wind, soft and eerie through the larches. She looked up. White clouds were crossing the blue. "Clouds," she said. "White lambs only," he replied. A shadow crossed the little clearing. The mole had swum out onto the soft yellow earth. "Unpleasant little beast, we ought to kill him," said Clifford. "Look, he's like a parson in a pulpit," she said. She gathered some sprigs of woodruff and brought them to him. "New-mown hay," he said. "Doesn't it smell like the romantic ladies of the last century who had their heads screwed on the right way after all?" She was looking at the white clouds. "I wonder if it will rain," she said. "Rain? Why, do you want it to?" They started on the return journey, Clifford jolting cautiously downhill. They came to the dark bottom of the hollow, turned to the right, and after 100 yards swerved up the foot of the long slope where bluebells stood in the light. "Now, old girl," said Clifford, putting the chair to it. It was a steep and jolty climb. The chair pugged slowly in a struggling, unwilling fashion. Still she nosed her way up unevenly, till she came to where the hyacinths were all around her. Then she balked, struggled, jerked a little way out of the flowers, then stopped. "We'd better sound the horn and see if the keeper will come," said Connie. "He could push her a bit. For that matter, I will push. It helps." "We'll let her breathe," said Clifford. "Do you mind putting a scotch under the wheel?" Connie found a stone, and they waited. After a while, Clifford started his motor again, then set the chair in motion. It struggled and faltered like a sick thing with curious noises. "Let me push," said Connie, coming up behind. "No, don't push," he said angrily. "What's the good of the damn thing if it has to be pushed? Put the stone under." There was another pause, then another start, but more ineffectual than before. "You must let me push," said she, "or sound the horn for the keeper." "Wait!" She waited, and he had another try, doing more harm than good. "Sound the horn, then, if you won't let me push," she said. "Hell, be quiet a moment." She was quiet a moment. He made shattering efforts with the little motor. "You'll only break the thing down altogether, Clifford," she remonstrated, "besides wasting your nervous energy." "If I could only get out and look at the damned thing," he said, exasperated, and he sounded the horn stridently. "Perhaps Mellors can see what's wrong." They waited among the mashed flowers, under a sky softly curdling with cloud. In the silence, a wood pigeon began to coo-roo, hoo-hoo, roo-hoo-hoo. Clifford shut her up with a blast on the horn. The keeper appeared directly, striding inquiringly round the corner. He saluted. "Do you know anything about motors?" asked Clifford sharply. "I'm afraid I don't. Has she gone wrong?" "Apparently," snapped Clifford. The man crouched solicitously by the wheel and peered down at the little engine. "I'm afraid I know nothing at all about these mechanical things, Sir Clifford," he said calmly. "If she has enough petrol and oil—" "Just look carefully and see if you can see anything broken," snapped Clifford. The man laid his gun against a tree, took off his coat, and threw it beside it. The brown dog sat guard. Then he sat down on his heels and peered under the chair, poking with his finger at the greasy little engine and resenting the grease marks on his clean Sunday shirt. "Doesn't seem anything broken," he said, and he stood up, pushing back his hat from his forehead, rubbing his brow and apparently studying. "Have you looked at the rods underneath?" asked Clifford. "See if they're all right." The man lay flat on his stomach on the floor, his neck pressed back, wriggling under the engine and poking with his finger. Connie thought what a pathetic sort of thing a man is, feeble and small-looking, when he was lying on his belly on the big earth. "Seems all right as far as I can see," came his muffled voice. "I don't suppose you can do anything," said Clifford. "Seems as if I can't." And he scrambled up and sat on his heels, collier fashion. "There's certainly nothing obviously broken." Clifford started his engine, then put her in gear. She would not move. "Run her a bit hard-like," suggested the keeper. Clifford resented the interference, but he made his engine buzz like a blue bottle. Then she coughed and snarled and seemed to go better. "Sounds as if she'd come clear," said Mellors. But Clifford had already jerked her into gear. She gave a sick lurch and ebbed weakly forward. "If I give her a push, she'll do it," said the keeper, going behind. "Keep off," snapped Clifford. "She'll do it by herself." "But Clifford," put in Connie from the bank, "you know it's too much for her. Why are you so obstinate?" Clifford was pale with anger. He jabbed at his levers. The chair gave a sort of scurry, reeled on a few more yards, and came to her end amid a particularly promising patch of bluebells. "She's done," said the keeper. "Not power enough." "She's been up here before," said Clifford coldly. "She won't do it this time," said the keeper. Clifford did not reply. He began doing things with his engine, running her fast and slow, as if to get some sort of tune out of her. The wood re-echoed with weird noises. Then he put her in gear with a jerk, having jerked off his brake. "You'll rip her inside out," murmured the keeper. The chair charged in a sick lurch sideways at the ditch. "Clifford!" cried Connie, rushing forward, but the keeper had got the chair by the rail. Clifford, however, putting on all his pressure, managed to steer into the riding, and with a strange noise of the chair was fighting the hill. Mellors pushed steadily behind, and up she went, as if to retrieve herself. "You see she's doing it," said Clifford, victorious, glancing over his shoulder. There he saw the keeper's face. "Are you pushing her? She won't do it without—" "Leave her alone, I asked you not. She won't do it." "Let her try," snarled Clifford, with all his emphasis. The keeper stood back, then turned to fetch his coat and gun. The chair seemed to go strange immediately. She stood inert. Clifford, seated, a prisoner, was white with vexation. He jerked at the levers with his hand. His feet were no good. He got queer noises out of her. In savage impatience he moved little handles and got more noises out of her, but she would not budge. No, she would not budge. He stopped the engine and sat rigid with anger. Constance sat on the bank and looked at the wretched and trampled bluebells. Nothing quite so lovely as an English spring. "I can do my share of ruling. What we need to take up now is whips, not swords, the ruling classes." The keeper stood up with his coat and gun, Flossie cautiously at his heels. Clifford asked the man to do something or other to the engine. Connie, who understood nothing at all of the technicalities of motors and who had had experience of breakdowns, sat patiently on the bank as if she were a cipher. The keeper lay on his stomach again, the ruling classes and the serving classes. He got to his feet and said patiently, "Try her again, then." He spoke in a quiet voice, almost as if to a child. Clifford tried her, and Mellors stepped quickly behind and began to push. She was going, the engine doing about half the work, the man the rest. Clifford glanced around, yellow with anger. "Will you get off there?" The keeper dropped his hold at once, and Clifford added, "How shall I know what she is doing?" The man put his gun down and began to pull on his coat. He'd done. The chair began slowly to run backwards. "Clifford, your brake!" cried Connie. She, Mellors, and Clifford moved at once, Connie and the keeper jostling lightly. The chair stood. There was a moment of dead silence. "It's obvious I'm at everybody's mercy," said Clifford. He was yellow with anger. No one answered. Mellors was slinging his gun over his shoulder, his face queer and expressionless, save for an abstracted look of patience. The dog, Flossie, standing on guard almost between her master's legs, moved uneasily, eyeing the chair with great suspicion and dislike, and very much perplexed between the three human beings. The tableau vivant remained set among the squashed bluebells, nobody proffering a word. "I expect she'll have to be pushed," said Clifford at last, with an affectation of sang-froid. No answer. Mellors' abstracted face looked as if he had heard nothing. Clifford glanced anxiously at him. Clifford, too, glanced around. "Do you mind pushing her home, Mellors?" he said in a cool, superior tone. "I hope I have said nothing to offend you," he added in a tone of dislike. "Nothing at all, Sir Clifford. Do you want me to push that chair?" "If you please." The man stepped up to it, but this time it was without effect. The brake was jammed. They poked and pulled, and the keeper took off his gun and his coat once more, and now Clifford said never a word. At last the keeper heaved the back of the chair off the ground, and with an instantaneous push of his foot tried to loosen the wheels. He failed. The chair sank. Clifford was clutching the sides. The man gasped with the weight. "Don't do it," cried Connie to him. "If you'll pull the wheel that way, so," he said to her, showing her how. "No, you mustn't lift it. You'll strain yourself," she said, flushed now with anger. But he looked into her eyes and nodded. And she had to go and take hold of the wheel, ready. He heaved, and she tugged, and the chair reeled. "For God's sake!" cried Clifford in terror. But it was all right, and the brake was off. The keeper put a stone under the wheel and went to sit on the bank. His heart beat, and his face white with the effort, semi-conscious. Connie looked at him and almost cried with anger. There was a pause and a dead silence. She saw his hands trembling on his thighs. "Have you hurt yourself?" she asked, going to him. "No, no," he turned away almost angrily. There was dead silence. The back of Clifford's fair head did not move. Even the dog stood motionless. The sky had clouded over. At last he sighed and blew his nose on his red handkerchief. "That pneumonia took a lot out of me," he said. No one answered. Connie calculated the amount of strength it must have taken to heave up that chair and the bulky Clifford. Too much. Far too much, if it hadn't killed him. He rose and again picked up his coat, slinging it through the handle of the chair. "Are you ready then, Sir Clifford?" "When you are." He stooped and took out the Scotch, then put his weight against the chair. He was paler than Connie had ever seen him, and more absent. Clifford was a heavy man, and the hill was steep. Connie stepped to the keeper's side. "I'm going to push too," she said. And she began to shove with a woman's turbulent energy of anger. The chair went faster. Clifford looked round. "Is that necessary?" he said. "Very. Do you want to kill the man? If you'd let the motor work while it would—" But she did not finish. She was already panting. She slackened off a little, for it was surprisingly hard work. "Aye, slower," said the man at her side with a faint smile of his eyes. "Are you sure you've not hurt yourself?" she said fiercely. He shook his head. She looked at his smallish, short, alive hand, browned by the weather. It was the hand that caressed her. She had never even looked at it before. It seemed so still, like him, with a curious inward stillness that made her want to clutch it, as if she could not reach it. All her soul suddenly swept towards him. He was so silent and out of reach. And she felt his limbs revive. Shoving with his left hand, he laid his right on her round white wrist, softly enfolding her wrist with a caress. And the flame of strength went down his back and his loins, reviving him. And she bent suddenly and kissed his hand. Meanwhile, the back of Clifford's head was held sleek and motionless just in front of them. At the top of the hill they rested, and Connie was glad to let go. She had had fugitive dreams of friendship between these two men, one her husband, the other the father of her child. Now she saw the screaming absurdity of her dreams. The two males were as hostile as fire and water. They mutually exterminated one another, and she realized for the first time what a queer, subtle thing hate is. For the first time she had consciously and definitely hated Clifford, with vivid hate, as if he ought to be obliterated from the face of the earth. And it was strange how free and full of life it made her feel to hate him, and to admit it fully to herself. "Now I've hated him, I shall never be able to go on living with him," came the thought into her mind. On the level, the keeper could push the chair alone. Clifford made a little conversation with her to show his complete composure, about Aunt Eva, who was at Dieppe, and about Sir Malcolm, who had written to ask would Connie drive with him in his small car to Venice, or would she and Hilda go by train. "I'd much rather go by train," said Connie. "I don't like long motor drives, especially when there's dust. But I shall see what Hilda wants." "She will want to drive her own car and take you with her," he said. "Probably. I must help up here. You've no idea how heavy this chair is." She went to the back of the chair and plodded side by side with the keeper, shoving up the pink path. She did not care who saw. "Why not let me wait and fetch Field? He is strong enough for the job," said Clifford. "It's so near," she panted. But both she and Malores wiped the sweat from their faces when they came to the top. It was curious, but this bit of work together had brought them much closer than they had been before. "Thanks so much, Malores," said Clifford when they were at the house door. "I must get a different sort of motor, that's all. Won't you go to the kitchen and have a meal? It must be about time." "Thank you, Sir Clifford. I was going to my mother for dinner today, Sunday." "As you like." Malores slung into his coat, looked at Connie, saluted, and was gone. Connie, furious, went upstairs. At lunch she could not contain her feeling. "Why are you so abominably inconsiderate, Clifford?" she said to him. "Of whom?" "Of the keeper. If that is what you call ruling classes, I'm sorry for you." "Why?" "A man who's been ill and isn't strong. My word, if I were the serving classes, I'd let you wait for service. I'd let you whistle." "I quite believe it." "If he'd been sitting in a chair with paralyzed legs and behaving as you behaved, what would you have done for him?" "My dear evangelist, this confusing of persons and personalities is in bad taste. And your nasty, sterile want of common sympathy is the worst taste imaginable. Noblesse oblige, you and your ruling class. And to what should it oblige me? To have a lot of unnecessary emotions about my gamekeeper? I refuse. I leave it all to my evangelist. As if he weren't a man as much as you are, my word. My gamekeeper to boot, and I pay him £2 a week and give him a house. Pay him. What do you think you pay for with £2 a week and a house? His services. Bah! I would tell you to keep your £2 a week and your house. Probably he would like to, but can't afford the luxury. You and rule, she said. You don't rule. Don't flatter yourself. You have only got more than your share of the money, and make people work for you for £2 a week, or threaten them with starvation. Rule. What do you give forth of rule? Why, you're dried up. You only bully with your money, like any Jew or any Schreiber. You are very elegant in your speech, Lady Chatterley. I assure you, you were very elegant altogether out there in the wood. I was utterly ashamed of you. Why, my father is 10 times the human being you are, you gentleman. He reached and rang the bell for Mrs. Bolton, but he was yellow at the gills. She went up to her room, furious, saying to herself, him and buying people, well, he doesn't buy me, and therefore there's no need for me to stay with him. Dead fish of a gentleman with his celluloid soul. And how they take one in with their manners and their mock wistfulness and gentleness. They've got about as much feeling as celluloid has. She made her plans for the night and determined to get Clifford off her mind. She didn't want to hate him. She didn't want to be mixed up very intimately with him in any sort of feeling. She wanted him not to know anything at all about herself, and especially not to know anything about her feeling for the keeper. This squabble of her attitude to the servants was an old one. He found her too familiar. She found him stupidly insentient, tough and india-rubbery where other people were concerned. She went downstairs calmly, with her old, demure bearing at dinner-time. He was still yellow at the gills, in for one of his liver bouts when he was really very queer. He was reading a French book. "Have you ever read Proust?" he asked her. "I've tried, but he bores me. He's really very extraordinary." "Possibly, but he bores me, all that sophistication. He doesn't have feelings, he only has streams of words about feelings. I'm tired of self-important mentalities." "Would you prefer self-important animalities?" "Perhaps, but one might possibly get something that wasn't self-important." "Well, I like Proust's subtlety and his well-bred anarchy." "It makes you very dead, really." There speaks my evangelical little wife. They were at it again, but she couldn't help fighting him. He seemed to sit there like a skeleton, sending out a skeleton's cold, grisly will against her. Almost she could feel the skeleton clutching her and pressing her to its cage of ribs. He, too, was really up in arms, and she was a little afraid of him. She went upstairs as soon as possible, and went to bed quite early. But at 9:30 she got up and went outside to listen. There was no sound. She slipped on a dressing-gown and went downstairs. Clifford and Mrs. Bolton were playing cards, gambling. They would probably go on until midnight. Connie returned to her room, threw her pajamas on the tossed bed, put on a thin tennis dress, and over that a woolen day dress, put on rubber tennis shoes, and then a light coat. And she was ready. If she met anybody, she was just going out for a few minutes. And in the morning, when she came in again, she would have been for a little walk in the dew, as she fairly often did before breakfast. For the rest, the only danger was that someone should go into her room during the night. But that was most unlikely, not one chance in 100. Betts had not locked up. He fastened up the house at 10 o'clock and unfastened it again at 7 in the morning. She slipped out silently and unseen. There was a half-moon shining, enough to make a little light in the world, not enough to show her up in the dark grey coat. She walked quickly across the park, not really in the thrill of the assignation, but with a certain anger and rebellion burning in her heart. It was not the right sort of heart to take to a love meeting, but la guerre comme la guerre. Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, Chapter 14. When she got near the park gate, she heard the click of the latch. He was there then, in the darkness of the wood, and had seen her. "You are good and early," he said out of the dark. "Was everything all right?" "Perfectly easy." He shut the gate quietly after her, and made a spot of light on the dark ground, showing the pallid flowers still standing there open in the night. They went on apart in silence. "Are you sure you didn't hurt yourself this morning with that chair?" she asked. No. "When you had that pneumonia, what did it do to you?" "Oh, nothing. It left my heart not so strong and the lungs not so elastic, but it always does that." "And you ought not to make violent physical efforts." "Not often." She plodded on in angry silence. "Did you hate Clifford?" she said at last. "Hate him? No. I've met too many like him to upset myself hating him. I know beforehand I don't care for his sort, and I let it go at that." "What is his sort?" "Nay, you know better than I do. The sort of youngish gentleman a bit like a lady and no balls. What balls? Balls? A man's balls. She pondered this. But is it a question of that, she said, a little annoyed. You say a man's got no brain when he's a fool, and no heart when he's mean, and no stomach when he's a funker, and when he's got none of that spunky, wild bit of a man in him, you say, he's got no balls, when he's a sort of tame. She pondered this. And is Clifford tame? She asked. Tame and nasty with it, like most such fellows when you come up against 'em. And you think you're not tame? Maybe not quite. At length she saw in the distance a yellow light. She stood still. There's a light, she said. I always leave a light in the house, he said. She went on again at his side, but not touching him, wondering why she was going with him at all. He unlocked and they went in, he bolting the door behind them. As if it were a prison, she thought. The kettle was singing by the red fire. There were cups on the table. She sat in the wooden armchair by the fire. It was warm after the chill outside. I'll take off my shoes, they are wet, she said. She sat with her stockinged feet on the bright steel fender. He went to the pantry bringing food, bread and butter and pressed tongue. She was warm. She took off her coat. He hung it on the door. Shall you have cocoa or tea or coffee to drink? He asked. I don't think I want anything, she said, looking at the table, but you eat. Nay, I don't care about it. I'll just feed the dog. He tramped with a quiet inevitability over the brick floor, putting food for the dog in a brown bowl. The spaniel looked up at him anxiously. Aye, this is thy supper. Thou needna look as if thou wouldna get it, he said. He set the bowl on the stair-foot mat and sat himself on a chair by the wall to take off his leggings and boots. The dog, instead of eating, came to him again and sat looking up at him, troubled. He slowly unbuckled his leggings. The dog edged a little nearer. What's amiss with you, then? Are you upset because there's somebody else here? Thou'rt a female, thou'rt. Go and eat the supper. He put his hand on her head, and the bitch leaned her head sideways against him. He slowly, softly pulled the long, silky ear. There, he said. There, go and eat thy supper, go. He tilted his chair toward the pot on the mat, and the dog meekly went and fell to eating. Do you like dogs? Connie asked him. No, not really. They're too tame and clinging. He had taken off his leggings and was unlacing his heavy boots. Connie had turned from the fire. How bare the little room was. Yet over his head on the wall hung a hideous enlarged photograph of a young married couple, apparently him and a bold-faced young woman, no doubt his wife. Is that you? Connie asked him. He twisted and looked at the enlargement above his head. Aye, taken just afore we was married, when I was 21. He looked at it impassively. Do you like it? Connie asked him. Like it? No. I never liked the thing, but she fixed it all up to have it done like. He returned to pulling off his boots. If you don't like it, why do you keep it hanging there? Perhaps your wife would like to have it, she said. He looked up at her with a sudden grin. She carted off everything as was worth taking from the house, he said, but she left that. Then why do you keep it? For sentimental reasons? Nay, I never look at it. I hardly knowed it were there. It's been there since we came to this place. Why don't you burn it? She said. He twisted round again and looked at the enlarged photograph. It was framed in a brown and gilt frame, hideous. It showed a clean-shaven, alert, very young-looking man in a rather high collar and a somewhat plump, bold young woman with her hair fluffed out and crimped and wearing a dark satin blouse. "It wouldn't be a bad idea, would it?" he said. He had pulled off his boots and put on a pair of slippers. He stood up on the chair and lifted down the photograph. It left a big, pale place on the greenish wallpaper. "No use dusting it now," he said, setting the thing against the wall. He went to the scullery and returned with hammer and pincers. Sitting where he had sat before, he started to tear off the back paper from the big frame and to pull out the sprigs that held the backboard in position, working with the immediate, quiet absorption that was characteristic of him. As soon as he had the nails out, then he pulled out the backboards, and then the enlargement itself in its solid white mount. He looked at the photograph with amusement. "Shows me for what I was, a young curate, and her for what she was. A bully," he said. "The prig and the bully." "Let me look," said Connie. He did look indeed very clean-shaven and very clean altogether, one of the clean young men of 20 years ago. But even in the photograph his eyes were alert and dauntless, and the woman was not altogether a bully, though her jowl was heavy. There was a touch of appeal in her. "One never should keep these things," said Connie. "That one shouldn't. One should never have them made." He broke the cardboard photograph and mount over his knee, and when it was small enough, put it on the fire. "It'll spoil the fire, though," he said. The glass and the backboard he carefully took upstairs. The frame he knocked asunder with a few blows of the hammer, making the stucco fly. Then he took the pieces into the scullery. "We'll burn that tomorrow," he said. "There's too much plaster moulding on it." Having cleared away, he sat down. "Did you love your wife?" she asked him. "Love?" he said. "Did you love Sir Clifford?" But she was not going to be put off. "But you cared for her," she insisted. "Cared?" he grinned. "Perhaps you care for her now," she said. "Me?" His eyes widened. "Ah, no, I can't think of her," he said quietly. "Why?" But he shook his head. "Then why don't you get a divorce? She'll come back to you one day," said Connie. He looked up at her sharply. "She wouldn't come within a mile of me. She hates me a lot worse than I hate her." "You'll see she'll come back to you." "That she never will. That's done. It would make me sick to see her." "You will see her, and you're not even legally separated, are you?" "No." "Ah, well then, she'll come back, and you'll have to take her in." He gazed at Connie fixedly. Then he gave the queer toss of his head. "You might be right. I was a fool ever to come back here, but I felt stranded and had to go somewhere. A man's a poor bit of a wastrel blown about. But you're right. I'll get a divorce and get clear. I hate those things like death, officials and courts and judges. But I've got to get through with it. I'll get a divorce." And she saw his jaw set. Inwardly she exulted. "I think I will have a cup of tea now," she said. He rose to make it, but his face was set. As they sat at table, she asked him, "Why did you marry her? She was commoner than yourself. Mrs. Bolton told me about her. She could never understand why you married her." He looked at her fixedly. "I'll tell you," he said. "The first girl I had I began with when I was 16. She was a schoolmaster's daughter over at Alderton. Pretty. Beautiful, really. I was supposed to be a clever sort of young fellow from Sheffield Grammar School with a bit of French and German, very much up aloft. She was the romantic sort that hated commonness. She egged me on to poetry and reading. In a way, she made a man of me. I read and I thought like a house on fire, for her. And I was a clerk in Butterley offices, thin, white-faced fellow, fuming with all the things I read, and about everything I talked to her, but everything. We talked ourselves into Persepolis and Timbuktu. We were the most literary, cultured couple in 10 counties. I held forth with rapture to her, positively with rapture. I simply went up in smoke. She adored me. The serpent in the grass was sex. She somehow didn't have any, at least not where it's supposed to be. I got thinner and crazier. Then I said we'd got to be lovers. I talked her into it as usual, so she let me. I was excited and she never wanted it. She just didn't want it. She adored me. She loved me to talk to her and kiss her in that way. She had a passion for me. But the other, she just didn't want. And there are lots of women like her. And it was just the other that I did want. So there we split. I was cruel and left her. Then I took on with another girl, a teacher who had made a scandal by carrying on with a married man and driving him nearly out of his mind. She was a soft, white-skinned, soft sort of a woman, older than me, and played the fiddle. And she was a demon. She loved everything about love except the sex. Clinging, caressing, creeping into you in every way, but if you forced her to the sex itself, she just ground her teeth and sent out hate. I forced her to it, and she could simply numb me with hate because of it. So I was balked again. I loathed all that. I wanted a woman who wanted me and wanted it. Then came Bertha Coates. They'd lived next door to us when I was a little lad, so I knew 'em all right, and they were common. Well, Bertha went away to some place or other in Birmingham, she said, as a lady's companion. Everybody else said as a waitress or something in a hotel. Anyhow, just when I was more than fed up with that other girl, when I was 21, back comes Bertha, with airs and graces and smart clothes and a sort of bloom on her, a sort of sensual bloom that you'd see sometimes on a woman, or on a trolley. Well, I was in a state of murder. I chucked up my job at Butterley because I thought I was a weed clerking there. And I got on as overhead blacksmith at Tevershall, shoeing horses mostly. It had been my dad's job, and I'd always been with him. It was a job I liked, handling horses, and it came natural to me. So I stopped talking fine, as they call it, talking proper English, and went back to talking broad. I still read books at home, but I blacksmithed and had a pony trap of my own, and was my Lord Duckfoot. My dad left me £300 when he died, so I took on with Bertha, and I was glad she was common. I wanted her to be common. I wanted to be common myself. Well, I married her, and she wasn't bad. Those other pure women had nearly taken all the balls out of me, but she was all right that way. She wanted me and made no bones about it. And I was pleased as punch. That was what I wanted, a woman who wanted me to fuck her, so I fucked her like a good 'un. And I think she despised me a bit for being so pleased about it and bringing her breakfast in bed sometimes. She sort of let things go, didn't let me get a proper dinner when I came home from work, and if I said anything, flew out at me. And I flew back, hammer and tongs. She flung a cup at me, and I took her by the scruff of the neck and squeezed the life out of her, that sort of thing. But she treated me with insolence, and she got so as she'd never have me when I wanted her, never. Always put me off, brutal as you like. And then, when she'd put me right off and I didn't want her, she'd come all lovey-dovey and get me, and I always went. But when I had her, she'd never come off when I did, never. She'd just wait. And if I kept back for half an hour, she'd keep back longer. And when I'd come and really finished, then she'd start on her own account, and I had to stop inside her till she'd brought herself off, wriggling and shouting. She'd clutch with herself down there, and then she'd come off, fair in ecstasy, and she'd say, "That was lovely." Gradually I got sick of it, and she got worse. She sort of got harder and harder to bring off, and she'd sort of tear at me down there, as if it was a beak tearing at me. By God, you'd think a woman's soft down there like a fig, but I tell you the old rampers have beaks between their legs, and they tear at you with it till you're sick. Self, 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 all self, daring and shouting. They talk about men's selfishness, but I doubt if I can ever touch a woman's blind beakishness once she's gone that way, like an old trull. And she couldn't help it. I told her about it. I told her how I hated it. And she'd even try. She'd try to lie still and let me work the business. She'd try, but it was no good. She got no feeling off it from my working. She had to work the thing herself, grind her own coffee, and it came back on her like a raving necessity. She had to let herself go and tear, as if she had no sensation in her except at the top of her beak, the very outside top tip that rubbed and tore. That's how old whores used to be, so men used to say. It was a low kind of self-will in her, a raving sort of self-will, like in a woman who drinks. Well, in the end I couldn't stand it. We slept apart. She herself had started it in her bouts when she wanted to be clear of me, when she said I bossed her. And she had started having a room for herself, but the time came when I wouldn't have her coming to my room. I wouldn't. I hated it, and she hated me. My God, how she hated me before that child was born. I often think she conceived it out of hate. Anyhow, after the child was born, I left her alone. And then came the war, and I joined up. And I didn't come back till I knew she was with that fellow at Stacksgate. He broke off, pale in the face. And what is the man at Stacksgate like? Asked Connie. A big baby sort of fellow, very low-mouthed. She bullies him, and they both drink. My word, if she came back. My God, yes, I should just go, disappear again. There was a silence. The pasteboard in the fire had turned to grey ash. So when you did get a woman who wanted you, said Connie, you got too much of a good thing. Aye, seems so. But even then I'd rather have her than Never Never ones, the white love of my youth, and that other poison-smelling Lily, and the rest. What about the rest? Said Connie. The rest? There is no rest. Only to my experience the mass of women are like this. Most of them want a man but don't want the sex, but they put up with it as part of the bargain. The more old-fashioned sort just lie there like nothing and let you go ahead. They don't mind afterwards. Then they like you. But the actual thing itself is nothing to them, a bit distasteful. And most men like it that way. I hate it. But the sly sort of women who are like that pretend they're not. They pretend they're passionate and have thrills. But it's all cock-a-loopy. They make it up. Then there's the ones that love everything, every kind of feeling and cuddling and going off, every kind except the natural one. They always make you go off when you're not in the only place you should be when you go off. Then there's the hard sort, that are the devil to bring off at all and bring themselves off like my wife. They want to be the active party. Then there's the sort that's just dead inside, but dead and they know it. Then there's the sort that puts you out before you really come and go on writhing their loins till they bring themselves off against your thighs. But they're mostly the lesbian sort. It's astonishing how lesbian women are, consciously or unconsciously. Seems to me they're nearly all lesbian. And do you mind? Asked Connie. I could kill them. When I'm with a woman who's really lesbian, I fairly howl in my soul, wanting to kill her. And what do you do? Just to go away as fast as I can. But do you think lesbian women any worse than homosexual men? I do, because I've suffered more from them. In the abstract, I've no idea. When I get with a lesbian woman, whether she knows she's one or not, I see red. No, but I wanted to have nothing to do with any woman anymore. I wanted to keep to myself, keep my privacy and my decency. He looked pale and his brows were somber. And were you sorry when I came along, she asked. I was sorry, and I was glad. And what are you now? I'm sorry from the outside, all the complications and the ugliness and the recrimination that's bound to come sooner or later. That's when my blood sinks and I'm low. But when my blood comes up, I'm glad. I'm even triumphant. I was really getting bitter. I thought there was no real sex left, never a woman who'd really come naturally with a man except black women, and somehow, well, we're white men, and they're a bit like mud. And now, are you glad of me? She asked. Yes, when I can forget the rest. When I can't forget the rest, I want to get under the table and die. Why under the table? Why? He laughed. Hide, I suppose. Baby. You do seem to have had awful experiences with women, she said. You see, I couldn't fool myself. That's where most men manage. They take an attitude and accept a lie. I could never fool myself. I knew what I wanted with a woman, and I could never say I'd got it when I hadn't. But have you got it now? Looks as if I might have. Then why are you so pale and gloomy? Belly full of remembering, and perhaps afraid of myself. She sat in silence. It was growing late. And do you think it's important, a man and a woman? She asked him. For me it is. For me it's the core of my life, if I have a right relation with a woman. And if you didn't get it, then I'd have to do without. Again she pondered before she asked, And do you think you've always been right with women? God, no. I let my wife get to what she was. My fault a good deal. I spoilt her, and I'm very mistrustful. You'll have to expect it. It takes a lot to make me trust anybody inwardly, so perhaps I'm a fraud too. I mistrust, and tenderness is not to be mistaken. She looked at him. You don't mistrust with your body when your blood comes up, she said. You don't mistrust then, do you? No, alas, that's how I've got into all the trouble, and that's why my mind mistrusts so thoroughly. Let your mind mistrust. What does it matter? The dog sighed with discomfort on the mat. The ash-clogged fire sank. We are a couple of battered warriors, said Connie. Are you battered too? He laughed. And here we are, returning to the fray. Yes, I feel really frightened. Aye. He got up and put her shoes to dry and wiped his own and set them near the fire. In the morning he would grease them. He poked the ash of the pasteboard as much as possible out of the fire. Even burnt it's filthy, he said. Then he brought sticks and put them on the hob for the morning. Then he went out a while with the dog. When he came back, Connie said, I want to go out too for a minute. She went alone in the darkness. There were stars overhead. She could smell flowers on the night air, and she could feel her wet shoes getting wetter again, but she felt like going away, right away from him and everybody. It was chilly. She shuddered and returned to the house. He was sitting in front of the low fire. Ugh, cold, she shuddered. He put the sticks on the fire and fetched more till they had a good crackling chimneyful of blaze. The rippling, running yellow flame made them both happy, warmed their faces and their souls. Never mind, she said, taking his hand as he sat silent and remote. One does one's best. Aye, he sighed with a twist of a smile. She slipped over to him and into his arms as he sat there before the fire. Forget, then, she whispered. Forget. He held her close in the running warmth of the fire. The flame itself was like a forgetting, and her soft, warm, ripe weight. Slowly his blood turned and began to ebb back into strength and reckless vigor again. And perhaps the women really wanted to be there and love you properly, only perhaps they couldn't. Perhaps it wasn't all their fault, she said. I know it. Do you think I don't know what a broken-backed snake that's been trodden on I was myself? She clung to him suddenly. She had not wanted to start all this again, yet some perversity had made her. But you're not now, she said. You're not that now, a broken-backed snake that's been trodden on. I don't know what I am. There's black days ahead. No, she protested, clinging to him. Why? Why? There's black days coming for us all and for everybody, he repeated with a prophetic gloom. No, you're not to say it. He was silent, but she could feel the black void of despair inside him. That was the death of all desire, the death of all love, this despair that was like the dark cave inside the men in which their spirit was lost. And you talk so coldly about sex, she said. You talk as if you had only wanted your own pleasure and satisfaction. She was protesting nervously against him. Nay, he said, I wanted to have my pleasure and satisfaction of a woman, and I never got it, because I could never get my pleasure and satisfaction of her unless she got hers of me at the same time. And it never happened. It takes two. But you never believed in your women. You don't even believe really in me, she said. I don't know what believing in a woman means. That's it, you see. She still was curled on his lap, but his spirit was grey and absent. He was not there for her, and everything she said drove him further. But what do you believe in? She insisted. I don't know. Nothing, like all the men I've ever known, she said. They were both silent. Then he roused himself and said, Yes, I do believe in something. I believe in being warm-hearted. I believe especially in being warm-hearted in love, in fucking with a warm heart. I believe if men could fuck with warm hearts and the women take it warm-heartedly, everything would come all right. It is all this cold-hearted fucking that is death and idiocy. But you don't fuck me cold-heartedly, she protested. I don't want to fuck you at all. My heart's as cold as cold potatoes just now. Oh, she said, kissing him mockingly, let's have them sot es. He laughed and sat erect. It's a fact, he said, anything for a bit of warm-heartedness, but the women don't like it. Even if you don't really like it, you like good, sharp, piercing, cold-hearted fucking, and then pretending it's all sugar. Where's your tenderness for me? You're as suspicious of me as a cat is of a dog. I tell you, it takes two, even to be tender and warm-hearted. You love fucking all right, but you want it to be called something grand and mysterious. Just to flatter your own self-importance. Your own self-importance is more to you, 50 times more than any man or being together with a man. But that's what I'd say of you. Your own self-importance is everything to you. Aye, very well then, he said, moving as if he wanted to rise. Let's keep apart then. I'd rather die than do any more cold-hearted fucking. She slid away from him, and he stood up. And do you think I want it? She said. I hope you don't, he replied. But anyhow, you go to bed and I'll sleep down here. She looked at him. He was pale, his brows were sullen, he was as distant in recoil as the cold pole. Men were all alike. "I can't go home till morning," she said. "No, go to bed. It's 1:15. "I certainly won't," she said. He went across and picked up his boots. "Then I'll go out," he said. He began to put on his boots. She stared at him. "Wait," she faltered. "Wait. What's come between us?" He was bent over, lacing his boot, and did not reply. The moments passed. A dimness came over her like a swoon. All her consciousness died, and she stood there wide-eyed, looking at him from the unknown, knowing nothing any more. He looked up because of the silence and saw her wide-eyed and lost. As if a wind tossed him, he got up and hobbled over to her, one shoe off and one shoe on, and took her in his arms, pressing her against his body, which somehow felt hurt right through. And there he held her, and there she remained, till his hands reached blindly down and felt for her, and felt under the clothing to where she was smooth and warm. "My lass," he murmured, "my little lass. Dunna let's light. Dunna let's never light. I love thee and the touch on thee. Dunna argue with me. Dunna let's be together." She lifted her face and looked at him. "Don't be upset," she said steadily. "It's no good being upset. Do you really want to be together with me?" She looked with wide, steady eyes into his face. He stopped and went suddenly still, turning his face aside. All his body went perfectly still, but did not withdraw. Then he lifted his head and looked into her eyes with his odd, faintly mocking grin, saying, "Aye, aye. Let's be together on oath." "But really," she said, her eyes filling with tears, "aye, really, heart and belly and cock." He still smiled faintly down at her, with the flicker of irony in his eyes and a touch of bitterness. She was silently weeping, and he lay with her and went into her there on the hearthrug, and so they gained a measure of equanimity. And then they went quickly to bed, for it was growing chill, and they had tired each other out. And she nestled up to him, feeling small and enfolded, and they both went to sleep at once, fast in one sleep. And so they lay and never moved, till the sun rose over the wood, and day was beginning. Then he woke up and looked at the light. The curtains were drawn. He listened to the loud, wild calling of blackbirds and thrushes in the wood. It would be a brilliant morning about 5:30, his hour for rising. He had slept so fast. It was such a new day. The woman was still curled asleep and tender. His hand moved on her, and she opened her blue, wondering eyes, smiling unconsciously into his face. "Are you awake?" she said to him. He was looking into her eyes. He smiled and kissed her, and suddenly she roused and sat up. "Fancy that I am here," she said. She looked round the whitewashed little bedroom with its sloping ceiling and gable window where the white curtains were closed. The room was bare, save for a little yellow-painted chest of drawers and a chair, and the smallish white bed in which she lay with him. "Fancy that we are here," she said, looking down at him. He was lying, watching her, stroking her breasts with his fingers under the thin nightdress. When he was warm and smoothed out, he looked young and handsome. His eyes could look so warm, and she was fresh and young like a flower. "I want to take this off," she said, gathering the thin batiste nightdress and pulling it over her head. She sat there with bare shoulders and longish breasts faintly golden. He loved to make her breasts swing softly like bells. "You must take off your pajamas too," she said. "Nay, Yes, yes, she commanded, and he took off his old cotton pajama jacket and pushed down the trousers. Save for his hands and wrists and face and neck, he was white as milk, with fine, slender, muscular flesh. To Connie he was suddenly piercingly beautiful again, as when she had seen him that afternoon washing himself. Gold of sunshine touched the closed white curtain. She felt it wanted to come in. "Oh, do let's draw the curtains. The birds are singing so. Do let the sun in," she said. He slipped out of bed with his back to her, naked and white and thin, and went to the window, stooping a little, drawing the curtains, and looking out for a moment. The back was white and fine, the small buttocks beautiful with an exquisite, delicate manliness, the back of the neck ruddy and delicate, and yet strong. There was an inward, not an outward, strength in the delicate, fine body. "But you are beautiful," she said, "so pure and fine. Come." She held her arms out. He was ashamed to turn to her because of his aroused nakedness. He caught his shirt off the floor and held it to him, coming to her. "No," she said, still holding out her beautiful slim arms from her dropping breasts. "Let me see you." He dropped the shirt and stood still looking towards her. The sun through the low window sent in a beam that lit up his thighs and slim belly and the erect phallus, rising darkish and hot-looking from the little cloud of vivid gold-red hair. She was startled and afraid. "How strange," she said slowly. "How strange he stands there, so big and so dark and cocksure. Is he like that?" The man looked down the front of his slender white body and laughed. Between the slim breasts the hair was dark, almost black, but at the root of the belly, where the phallus rose thick and arcing, it was gold-red, vivid in a little cloud. "So proud," she murmured, uneasy, "and so lordly. Now I know why men are so overbearing. But he's lovely, really, like another being, a bit terrifying, but lovely, really, and he comes to me." She caught her lower lip between her teeth in fear and excitement. The man looked down in silence at the tense phallus that did not change. "Aye," he said at last in a little voice. "Aye, my lad, they're there right enough. Ye them and rear their head. They're on thy own, eh? And there's no count on nobody. The mace now to me, John Thomas, art boss of me. Eh, well, thou're more cocky than me, and the says less. John Thomas, dost want her? Dost want my Lady Jane? Tha's dipped me in again, thou hast. Aye, and thou comes up smiling. Ask her then. Ax Lady Jane, say, lift up your heads, O ye gates, that the King of Glory may come in. And the cheek on the cunt, that's what they're after. Tell Lady Jane thou wants cunt. John Thomas, and the cunt, oh, Lady Jane." "Oh, don't tease him," said Connie, crawling on her knees on the bed towards him and putting her arms round his white, slender loins and drawing him to her so that her hanging, swinging breasts touched the tip of the stirring, erect phallus and caught the drop of moisture. She held the man fast. "Lie down," he said. "Lie down, let me come." He was in a hurry now. And afterwards, when they had been quite still, the woman had to uncover the man again to look at the mystery of the phallus. "And now he's tiny and soft like a little bud of life," she said, taking the soft, small penis in her hand. "Isn't he somehow lovely? And so on his own, so strange and so innocent, and he comes so far into me. You must never insult him, you know. He's mine, too. He's not only yours, he's mine. And so lovely and innocent. And she held the penis soft in her hand. He laughed. Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in kindred love, he said. Of course, she said, even when he's soft and little, I feel my heart simply tied to him. And how lovely your hair is here. Quite different. That's John Thomas' hair, not mine, he said. John Thomas, and she quickly kissed the soft penis that was beginning to stir again. Aye, said the man, stretching his body almost painfully. He's got his root in my soul, has that gentleman, and sometimes I don't know what to do with him. Aye, he's got a will of his own, and it's hard to suit him. Yet I wouldn't have him killed. No wonder men have always been afraid of him, she said. He's rather terrible. The quiver was going through the man's body as the stream of consciousness again changed its direction, turning downwards. And he was helpless as the penis in slow, soft undulations filled and surged and rose up and grew hard, standing there and overweening in its curious, towering fashion. The woman, too, trembled a little as she watched. There, take him then. He's thine, said the man. And she quivered, and her own mind melted out. Soft, sharp waves of unspeakable pleasure washed over her as he entered her, and started the curious molten thrilling that spread and spread till she was carried away with the last blind flush of extremity. He heard the distant hooters of Stack's Gate for 7 o'clock. It was Monday morning. He shivered a little, and with his face between her breasts pressed her soft breasts up over his ears to deafen him. She had not even heard the hooters. She lay perfectly still, her soul washed transparent. You must get up, mustn't you? He muttered. What time? Came her colourless voice. 7 o'clock blower's a bit soon. I suppose I must. She was resenting, as she always did, the compulsion from outside. He sat up and looked blankly out of the window. You do love me, don't you? She asked calmly. He looked down at her. Thou knows what thou knows. What dost ask for? He said a little fretfully. I want you to keep me, not to let me go, she said. His eyes seemed full of a warm, soft darkness that could not think. When? Now? Now, in your heart. Then I want to come and live with you, always, soon. He sat naked on the bed, with his head dropped, unable to think. Don't you want it? She asked. Aye, he said. Then with the same eyes darkened with another flame of consciousness, almost like sleep, he looked at her. Dinna ask me naught now, he said. Let me be. I like thee, I love thee when the lie's near. A woman's a lovely thing when her's deep ter fuck and cunts good, and love thee thy legs and the shape on thee and the womanness on thee. I love the womanness on thee. I love thee wi' my back and wi' me heart. But dinna ax me nowt. Dinna make me say nowt. Let me stop as I am while I can. Thou can ax me everything after. Now, let me be. Let me be. And softly he laid his hand over her mound of Venus on the soft brown maiden hair, and himself sat still and naked on the bed, his face motionless in physical abstraction, almost like the face of Buddha. Motionless, and in the invisible flame of another consciousness, he sat with his hand on her and waited for the turn. After a while he reached for his shirt and put it on, dressed himself swiftly in silence, looked at her once as she still lay naked and faintly golden like a gloire de Dijon rose on the bed, and was gone. She heard him downstairs opening the door. And still she lay musing, musing. It was very hard to go out of his arms. He called from the foot of the stairs, 7:30. She sighed and got out of bed. The bare little room, nothing in it at all but the small chest of drawers and the smallish bed. But the board floor was scrubbed clean, and in the corner by the window gable was a shelf with some books, and some from a circulating library. She looked. There were books about Bolshevist Russia, books of travel, a volume about the atom and the electron, another about the composition of the Earth's core and the causes of earthquakes. Then a few novels, then 3 books on India. So, he was a reader after all. The sun fell on her naked limbs through the gable window. Outside she saw the dog Flossie roaming around. The hazel brake was misted with green and dark green dog's mercury under. It was a clear, clean morning with birds flying and triumphantly singing. If only she could stay. If only there weren't the other ghastly world of smoke and iron. If only he would make her a world. She came downstairs, down the steep, narrow wooden stairs. Still she would be content with this little house if only it were in a world of its own. He was washed and fresh, and the fire was burning. "Will you eat anything?" he said. "No, only lend me a comb." She followed him into the scullery and combed her hair before the handbreadth of mirror by the back door. Then she was ready to go. She stood in the little front garden looking at the dewy flowers, the gray bed of pinks in bud already. "I would like to have all the rest of the world disappear," she said, "and live with you here." "It won't disappear," he said. They went almost in silence through the lovely, dewy wood, but they were together in a world of their own. It was bitter to her to go on to Ragby. "I want soon to come and live with you altogether," she said as she left him. He smiled, unanswering. She got home quietly and unremarked, and went up to her room. Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, Chapter 15. There was a letter from Hilda on the breakfast tray. "Father is going to London this week, and I shall call for you on Thursday week, June 17th. You must be ready so that we can go at once. I don't want to waste time at Ragby. It's an awful place. I shall probably stay the night at Retford with the Colemans, so I should be with you for lunch, Thursday. Then we could start at tea-time and sleep perhaps in Grantham. It is no use our spending an evening with Clifford. If he hates your going, it would be no pleasure to him." So, she was being pushed round on the chessboard again. Clifford hated her going, but it was only because he didn't feel safe in her absence. Her presence, for some reason, made him feel safe, and free to do the things he was occupied with. He was a great deal at the pits, and wrestling in spirit with the almost hopeless problems of getting out his coal in the most economical fashion, and then selling it when he'd got it out. He knew he ought to find some way of using it, or converting it, so that he needn't sell it, or needn't have the chagrin of failing to sell it. But if he made electric power, could he sell that or use it? And to convert into oil was as yet too costly and too elaborate. To keep industry alive, there must be more industry, like a madness. It was a madness, and it required a madman to succeed in it. Well, he was a little mad. Connie thought so. His very intensity and acumen in the affairs of the pits seemed like a manifestation of madness to her. His very inspirations were the inspirations of insanity. He talked to her of all his serious schemes, and she listened in a kind of wonder and let him talk. Then the flow ceased, and he turned on the loudspeaker, and became a blank, while apparently his schemes coiled on inside him like a kind of dream. And every night now he played pontoon, the game of the Tommies with Mrs. Bolton, gambling with sixpences. And again, in the gambling, he was gone into a kind of unconsciousness, or blank intoxication, or intoxication of blankness, whatever it was. Connie could not bear to see him. But when she had gone to bed, he and Mrs. Bolton would gamble on till 2 and 3 in the morning, safely, and with strange lust. Mrs. Bolton was caught in the lust as much as Clifford, the more so as she nearly always lost. She told Connie one day, "I lost 23 shillings to Sir Clifford last night." "And did he take the money from you?" asked Connie, aghast. "Why, of course, my lady, debt of honour." Connie expostulated roundly, and was angry with both of them. The upshot was, Sir Clifford raised Mrs. Bolton's wages 100 a year, and she could gamble on that. Meanwhile, it seemed to Connie, Clifford was really going deader. She told him at length she was leaving on the 17th. 17th, he said, "and when will you be back?" "By the 20th of July at the latest." Yes, the 20th of July. Strangely and blankly he looked at her, with the vagueness of a child, but with the queer blank cunning of an old man. "You won't let me down now, will you?" he said. "How?" "While you're away, I mean. You're sure to come back." "I'm as sure as I can be of anything that I shall come back." "Yes, well, 20th of July." He looked at her so strangely. Yet he really wanted her to go. That was so curious. He wanted her to go, positively, to have her little adventures and to perhaps come home pregnant and all that. At the same time, he was afraid of her going. She was quivering, watching her real opportunity for leaving him altogether, waiting till the time himself, should be ripe. She sat and talked to the keeper of her going abroad. "And then, when I come back," she said, "I can tell Clifford I must leave him, and you and I can go away. They never need even know it is you. We can go to another country, shall we? To Africa or Australia. Shall we?" She was quite thrilled by her plan. "You've never been to the colonies, have you?" he asked her. "No, have you?" "I've been in India and South Africa and Egypt." "Why shouldn't we go to South Africa?" "We might," he said slowly. "Or don't you want to?" she asked. "I don't care. I don't much care what I do." "Doesn't it make you happy?" "Why not? We shan't be poor. I have about 600 a year. I wrote and asked. It's not much, but it's enough, isn't it?" "It's riches to me." "Oh, how lovely it will be." "But I ought to get divorced, and so ought you, unless we're going to have complications." There was plenty to think about. Another day she asked him about himself. They were in the hut, and there was a thunderstorm. "And weren't you happy when you were a lieutenant and an officer and a gentleman?" "Happy? All right. I liked my colonel." "Did you love him?" "Yes, I loved him." "And did he love you?" "Yes, in a way he loved me." "Tell me about him." "What is there to tell? He had risen from the ranks. He loved the army, and he never married. He was 20 years older than me. He was a very intelligent man, and alone in the army, as such a man is. A passionate man in his way, and a very clever officer. I lived under his spell while I was with him. I sort of let him run my life, and I never regret it." "And did you mind very much when he died?" "I was as near death myself, but when I came to, I knew another part of me was finished. But then I'd always known it would finish in death. All things do as far as that goes. She sat and ruminated. The thunder crashed outside. It was like being in a little ark in the flood. "You seem to have such a lot behind you," she said. "Do I? It seems to me I've died once or twice already. Yet here I am pegging on and in for more trouble." She was thinking hard, yet listening to the storm. "And weren't you happy as an officer and a gentleman when your colonel was dead?" "No, they were a mingy lot," he laughed suddenly. "The colonel used to say, 'Lad, the English middle classes have to chew every mouthful 30 times because their guts are so narrow. A bit as big as a pea would give them a stoppage. They're the mingiest set of ladylike snipe ever invented, full of conceit of themselves, frightened even if their bootlaces aren't correct, rotten as high game, and always in the right. That's what finishes me up. Kowtow, arse-licking till their tongues are tough, yet they're always in the right. Prigs on top of everything, prigs. A generation of ladylike prigs with half a ball each." Connie laughed. The rain was rushing down. "He hated them." "No," said he didn't bother. He just disliked them. There's a difference. Because, as you said, the Tommies are getting just as priggish and half-balled and narrow-gutted. It's the fate of mankind to go that way." "The common people, too? The working people?" "All the lot. Their spunk is gone dead. Motor cars and cinemas and aeroplanes suck the last bit out of them. I tell you, every generation breeds a more rabbity generation with India rubber tubing for guts and tin legs and tin faces. Tin people. It's all a steady sort of Bolshevism, just killing off the human thing and worshipping the mechanical thing. Money, money, money. All the modern lot get the real kick out of killing the old human feeling out of man, making mincemeat of the old Adam and the old Eve. They're all alike. The world is all alike. Kill off the human reality. A quid for every foreskin. 2 quid for each pair of balls. What is cunt but machine fucking? It's all alike. Pay 'em money to cut off the world's cock. Pay money, money, money to them. That will take spunk out of mankind and leave 'em all little twiddling machines." He sat there in the hut, his face pulled up to mocking irony. Yet even then he had one ear set backwards, listening to the storm over the wood. It made him feel so alone. "But won't it ever come to an end?" she said. "Aye, it will. It'll achieve its own salvation. When the last real man is killed, and they're all tame, white, black, yellow, all colours of tame ones, then they'll all be insane, because the root of sanity is in the balls. Then they'll all be insane, and they'll make their grand auto da fe. You know, auto da fe means act of faith. Aye, well, they'll make their own grand little act of faith. They'll offer one another up." "You mean kill one another?" "I do, ducky. If we go on at our present rate, then in 100 years' time there won't be 10,000 people on this island. There may not be 10. They'll have lovingly wiped each other out." The thunder was rolling further away. "How nice," she said. "Quite nice. To contemplate the extermination of the human species and the long pause that follows before some other species crops up, it calms you more than anything else. And if we go on in this way, with everybody, intellectuals, artists, government, industrialists and workers all frantically killing off the last human feeling, the last bit of their intuition, the last healthy instinct, if it goes on in an algebraical progression as it's going on, then ta-ta to the human species. Goodbye, darling. The serpent swallows itself and leaves a void, considerably messed up but not hopeless. very nice. When the savage wild dogs bark in Ragby and the savage wild pit ponies stamp on Tevershall pitbank, Te Deum laudamus. Connie laughed, but not very happily. Then you ought to be pleased that they are all Bolshevists, she said. You ought to be pleased that they hurry on toward the end. So I am. I don't stop 'em, because I couldn't if I would. Then why are you so bitter? I'm not. If my cock gives its last crow, I don't mind. But if you have a child, she said. He dropped his head. Why, he said at last, it seems to me a wrong and bitter thing to do, to bring a child into this world. No, don't say it, she pleaded. I think I'm going to have one. Say you'll be pleased. She laid her hand on his. I'm pleased for you to be pleased, he said, but for me it seems a ghastly treachery to the unborn creature. Ah, no, she said, shocked. Then you can't ever really want one. You can't want one if you feel that. Again he was silent, his face sullen. Outside there was only the threshing of the rain. It's not quite true, she whispered. It's not quite true. There's another truth. She felt he was bitter now, partly because she was leaving him, deliberately going away to Venice. And this half pleased her. She pulled open his clothing and uncovered his belly and kissed his navel. Then she laid her cheek on his belly and pressed her arm around his warm, silent loins. They were alone in the flood. Tell me you want a child in hope, she murmured, pressing her face against his belly. Tell me you do. Why, he said at last, and she felt the curious quiver of changing consciousness and relaxation going through his body. Why, I've thought sometimes if one but tried, here among the colliers even. They're working bad now, and not earning much. If a man could say to 'em, "Dinna think o' nowt but the money. When it comes to wants, we want but little. Let's not live for money." She softly rubbed her cheek on his belly and gathered his balls in her hand. The penis stirred softly with strange life but did not rise up. The rain beat bruisingly outside. Let's live for something else. Let's not live to make money, neither for ourselves nor for anybody else. Now we're forced to make a bit for ourselves, and then a fair lot for the bosses. Let's stop it, bit by bit, let's stop it. We needn't rant and rave. Bit by bit, let's drop the whole industrial life and go back. The least little bit of money'll do. For everybody, me and you, bosses and masters, even the king. The least little bit of money will really do. Just make up your mind to it, and you've got out of the mess. He paused and then went on. And I'd tell him, look at Joe. He moves lovely. Look how he moves, alive and aware. He's beautiful. And look at Jonah. He's clumsy, he's ugly, because he's never willing to rouse himself. If I'd tell him, look at yourselves, one shoulder higher than t'other, legs twisted, feet all lumps. What have you done to yourselves with the blasted work? Spoilt yourselves. No need to work that much. Take your clothes off and look at yourselves. You ought to be alive and beautiful, and you're ugly and half dead. So I'd tell 'em, and I'd get my men to wear different clothes, up-and clothes, red trousers, bright red, and little short white jackets. Why, if men had red, fine legs, that alone would change them in a month. They'd begin to be men again, to be men. And the women could dress as they liked, Because if once the men walked with legs close, bright, scarlet, and buttocks nice and showing scarlet under a little white jacket, then the woman had begun to be woman. But it's because the men aren't men that the women have to be. And in time pull down Tevershall and build a few beautiful buildings that would hold us all. And clean the country up again, and not have many children because the world is overcrowded. But I wouldn't preach to the men, only strip 'em and say, look at yourselves, that's working for money. Hark at yourselves, that's working for money. You've been working for money. Look at Tevershall, it's horrible. And that's because it was built while you was working for money. Look at your girls. They don't care about you. You don't care about them. It's because you've spent your time working and caring for money. You can't talk, nor move, nor live. You can't properly be with a woman. You're not alive. Look at yourselves. There fell a complete silence. Connie was half listening and threading in the hair at the root of his belly a few forget-me-nots that she had gathered on the way to the hut. Outside the world had gone still and a little icy. You've got 4 kinds of hair, she said to him. On your chest it's nearly black, and your hair isn't dark on your head, but your mustache is hard and dark red, and your hair here, your love hair, is like a little brush of bright red gold mistletoe. It's the loveliest of all. He looked down and saw the milky bits of forget-me-nots in the hair on his groin. Aye, that's where to put forget-me-nots, in the man hair or the maiden hair. But don't you care about the future? She looked up at him. Oh, I do terribly, she said. Because when I feel the human world has doomed itself by its own mingy beastliness, then I feel the colonies aren't far enough. The moon wouldn't be far enough, because even there you could look back and see the earth dirty, beastly, unsavoury among all the stars made foul by men. Then I feel I've swallowed gall, and it's eating my inside out, and nowhere's far enough away to get away. But when I get a turn, I forget it all again. Though it's a shame what's been done to people these last 100 years, men turned into nothing but labour insects, and all their manhood taken away, and all their real life. I'd wipe the machines off the face of the earth again, and end the industrial epoch absolutely, like a black mistake. But since I can't, and nobody can, I'd better hold my peace and try to live my own life, if I've got one to live, which I rather doubt. The thunder had ceased outside, but the rain, which had abated, suddenly came striking down with a last blench of lightning and mutter of departing storm. Connie was uneasy. He had talked so long now, and he was really talking to himself, not to her. Despair seemed to come down on him completely, and she was feeling happy. She hated despair. She knew her leaving him, which he had only just realized inside himself, had plunged him back into his mood. And she triumphed a little. She opened the door and looked at the straight, heavy rain like a steel curtain, and had a sudden desire to rush out into it, to rush away. She got up and began swiftly pulling off her stockings, then her dress and underclothing, and he held his breath. Her pointed, keen animal breasts tipped and stirred as she moved. She was ivory-colored in the greenish light. She slipped on her rubber shoes again and ran out with a wild little laugh, holding up her breasts to the heavy rain and spreading her arms and running blurred in the rain with the eurythmic dance movements she had learned so long ago in Dresden. It was a strange, pallid figure lifting and falling, bending so the rain beat and glistened on the full haunches, swaying up again and coming belly forward through the rain, then stooping again so that only the full loins and buttocks were offered in a kind of homage towards him, repeating a wild obeisance. He laughed wryly and threw off his clothes. It was too much. He jumped out, naked and white, with a little shiver, into the hard, slanting rain. Flossie sprang before him with a frantic little bark. Connie, her hair all wet and sticking to her head, turned her hot face and saw him. Her blue eyes blazed with excitement as she turned and ran fast with a strange charging movement out of the clearing and down the path, the wet boughs whipping her. She ran, and he saw nothing but the round, wet head, the wet back leaning forward in flight, the rounded buttocks twinkling. A wonderful, cowering female nakedness in flight. She was nearly at the wide riding when he came up and flung his naked arm round her soft, naked, wet middle. She gave a shriek and straightened herself, and the heap of her soft, chill flesh came up against his body. He pressed it all up against him, madly. The heap of soft, chilled female flesh then became quickly warm as flame in contact. The rain streamed on them till they smoked. He gathered her lovely, heavy posteriors, one in each hand, and pressed them in towards him in a frenzy, quivering, motionless in the rain. Then suddenly he tipped her up and fell with her on the path in the roaring silence of the rain, and short and sharp he took her, short and sharp and finished like an animal. He got up in an instant, wiping the rain from his eyes. "Come in," he said, and they started running back to the hut. He ran straight and swift. He didn't like the rain, but she came slower, gathering forget-me-nots and campion and bluebells, running a few steps and watching him fleeing away from her. When she came in with her flowers, panting, to the hut, he had already started a fire, and the twigs were crackling. Her sharp breasts rose and fell, her hair was plastered down with rain, her face was flushed ruddy, and her body glistened and trickled. Wide-eyed and breathless, with a small wet head and full trickling haunches, she looked another creature. He took the old sheet and rubbed her down, she standing like a child. Then he rubbed himself, having shut the door of the hut. The fire was blazing up. She ducked her head in the other end of the sheet and rubbed her wet hair. "We're drying ourselves together on the same towel. We shall quarrel," he said. She looked up for a moment, her hair all odds and ends. "No," she said, her eyes wide. "It's not a towel, it's a sheet." And she went on busily rubbing her head, while he busily rubbed his. Still panting with their exertions, each wrapped in an army blanket, but the front of the body open to the fire, they sat on a log, side by side before the blaze, to get quiet. Connie hated the feel of the blanket against her skin, but now the sheet was all wet. She dropped her blanket and kneeled on the clay hearth, holding her head to the fire and shaking her hair to dry it. He watched the beautiful curving drop of her haunches. That fascinated him today, how it sloped with a rich downslope to the heavy roundness of her buttocks, and in between, folded in the secret warmth, the secret entrances. He stroked her tail with his hand, long and subtly taking the curves and the globe fullness. "There's got such a nice tail on thee," he said, in the throaty, caressive dialect. "There's got the nicest arse of anybody. It's the nicest woman's arse as is. And every bit of it is woman. Woman sure as nuts. Thou'rt not one of them button-arsed lasses as should be lads arter. There's got a real soft sloping bottom on thee, as a man loves in his guts. It's a bottom as could hold the world up. It is." All the while he spoke, he exquisitely stroked the rounded tail, till it seemed as if a slippery sort of fire came from it into his hands, and his fingertips touched the two secret openings to her body, time after time, with a soft little brush of fire. "And if the shits, and if the pisses, I'm glad I don't want a woman as couldn't a shit nor piss. Connie could not help a sudden snort of astonished laughter, but he went on, unmoved. "Thou'rt real, thou'rt. Thou'rt real even a bit of a bitch. And here are the shits, and here are the pisses, and I lay my hand on 'em both, and like thee for it. I like thee for it. Thou's got a proper woman's arse, proud of itself. It's none ashamed of itself, this isna." He laid his hand close and firm over her secret places, in a kind of close greeting. "I like it," he said. "I like it. And if I only lived 10 minutes and stroked thy arse and got to know it, I should reckon I'd lived. One life, Seater. Industrial system or not, here's one of my lifetimes." She turned round and climbed into his lap, clinging to him. "Kiss me," she whispered. And she knew the thought of their separation was latent in both their minds, and at last she was sad. She sat on his thighs, her head against his breast, and her ivory, gleaming legs loosely apart, the fire glowing unequally upon them. Sitting with his head dropped, he looked at the folds of her body in the fire glow, and at the fleece of soft brown hair that hung down to a point between her open thighs. He reached to the table behind and took up her bunch of flowers, still so wet that drops of rain fell onto her. "Flowers stops out of doors all weathers," he said. "They have no houses." "Not even a hut," she murmured. With quiet fingers he threaded a few forget-me-not flowers in the fine brown fleece of the mound of Venus. "There," he said, "there's forget-me-nots in the right place." She looked down at the milky, odd little flowers among the brown maiden hair at the lower tip of her body. "Doesn't it look pretty?" she said. "Pretty as life," he replied. And he stuck a pink campion bud among the hair. "There, that's me where you won't forget me. That's Moses in the bulrushes." "You don't mind, do you, that I'm going away?" she asked wistfully, looking up into his face. But his face was inscrutable under the heavy brows. He kept it quite blank. "You do as you wish," he said, and he spoke in good English. "But I won't go if you don't wish it," she said, clinging to him. There was silence. He leaned and put another piece of wood on the fire. The flame glowed on his silent, abstracted face. She waited, but he said nothing. "Only I thought it would be a good way to begin a break with Clifford. I do want a child, and it would give me a chance to, she resumed. "To let them think a few lies," he said. "Yes, that among other things. Do you want them to think the truth?" "I don't care what they think." "I do. I don't want them handling me with their unpleasant, cold minds, not while I'm still at Ragby. They can think what they like when I'm finally gone." He was silent. "But Sir Clifford expects you to come back to him?" "Oh, I must come back," she said, and there was silence. "And would you have a child in Ragby?" he asked. She closed her arm round his neck. "If you wouldn't take me away, I should have to," she said. "Take you where to?" "Anywhere. Away, but right away from Ragby." "When?" "Why, when I come back." "But what's the good of coming back, doing the thing twice, if you're once gone?" he said. "Oh, I must come back. I've promised. I've promised so faithfully. Besides, I come back to you, really. To your husband's gamekeeper." "I don't see that matters," she said. "No?" He mused a while. "And when would you think of going away again, then, finally? When, exactly?" "Oh, I don't know. I'd come back from Venice, and then we'd prepare everything. How prepare? Oh, I'd tell Clifford. I'd have to tell him. Would you? He remained silent. She put her arms round his neck. Don't make it difficult for me, she pleaded. Make what difficult? For me to go to Venice and arrange things. A little smile, half a grin, flickered on his face. I don't make it difficult, he said. I only want to find out just what you are after. But you don't really know yourself. You want to take time, get away and look at it. I don't blame you. I think you're wise. You may prefer to stay mistress of Ragby. I don't blame you. I've no Ragbys to offer. In fact, you know what you'll get out of me. No, I think you're right. I really do. And I'm not keen on coming to live on you, being kept by you. There's that, too. She felt somehow as if he were giving her tit for tat. But you want me, don't you? She asked. Do you want me? You know I do. That's evident. Quite. And when do you want me? You know, we can arrange it all when I come back. Now I'm out of breath with you. I must get calm and clear. Quite. Get calm and clear. She was a little offended. But you trust me, don't you? She said. Oh, absolutely. She heard the mockery in his tone. Tell me then, she said flatly, do you think it would be better if I don't go to Venice? I'm sure it's better if you do go to Venice, he replied in the cool, slightly mocking voice. You know it's next Thursday, she said. Yes. She now began to muse. At last she said, and we shall know better where we are when I come back, shan't we? Oh, surely. The curious gulf of silence between them. I've been to the lawyer about my divorce, he said, a little constrainedly. She gave a slight shudder. Have you? And what did he say? He said I ought to have done it before. That may be a difficulty. But since I was in the army, he thinks it will go through all right. If only it doesn't bring her down on my head. Will she have to know? Yes, she is served with a notice. So is the man she lives with, the co-respondent. Isn't it hateful, all the performances? I suppose I'd have to go through it with Clifford. There was a silence. And of course, he said, I have to live an exemplary life for the next 6 or 8 months. So if you go to Venice, there's temptation removed for a week or 2 at least. Am I temptation? She said, stroking his face. I'm so glad I'm temptation to you. Don't let's think about it. You frighten me when you start thinking. You roll me out flat. Don't let's think about it. We can think so much when we are apart. That's the whole point. I've been thinking I must come to you for another night before I go. I must come once more to the cottage. Shall I come on Thursday night? Isn't that when your sister will be there? Yes, but she said we would start at tea time, so we could start at tea time. But she could sleep somewhere else, and I could sleep with you. But then she'd have to know. Oh, I shall tell her. I've more or less told her already. I must talk it all over with Hilda. She's a great help, so sensible. He was thinking of her plan. So you'd start off from Ragby at tea time, as if you were going to London. Which way were you going? By Nottingham and Grantham. And then your sister would drop you somewhere, and you'd walk or drive back here. Sounds very risky to me. Does it? Well, then, Hilda could bring me back. She could sleep at Mansfield and bring me back here in the evening and fetch me again in the morning. It's quite easy. And the people who see you? I'll wear goggles and a veil. He pondered for some time. Well, he said, you please yourself as usual. But wouldn't it please you?" "Oh, yes, it'd please me all right," he said a little grimly. "I might as well smite while the iron's hot." "Do you know what I thought?" she said suddenly. "It suddenly came to me. You are the knight of the burning pestle." "Aye, and are you the lady of the red-hot mortar?" Yes, she said. "You're Sir Pestle and I'm Lady Mortar." "All right, then I'm knighted. John Thomas is Sir John to your Lady Jane." "Yes, John Thomas is knighted. I'm my Lady Maidenhair, and you must have flowers too, yes." She threaded 2 pink campions in the bush of red gold hair above his penis. "There," she said, "charming, charming Sir John." And she pushed a bit of forget-me-not in the dark hair of his breast. "And you won't forget me there, will you?" She kissed him on the breast and made 2 bits of forget-me-not lodge one over each nipple, kissing him again. "Make a calendar of me," he said. He laughed, and the flowers shook from his breast. "Wait a bit," he said. He rose and opened the door of the hut. Flossie, lying on the porch, got up and looked at him. "Aye, it's me," he said. The rain had ceased. There was a wet, heavy, perfumed stillness. Evening was approaching. He went out and down the little path in the opposite direction from the riding. Connie watched his thin white figure, and it looked to her like a ghost, an apparition moving away from her. When she could see it no more, her heart sank. She stood in the door of the hut with a blanket round her, looking into the drenched, motionless silence. But he was coming back, trotting strangely and carrying flowers. She was a little afraid of him, as if he were not quite human. And when he came near, his eyes looked into hers, but she could not understand the meaning. He had brought columbines and campions, and new-mown hay, and oak tufts, and honeysuckle in small bud. He fastened fluffy young oak sprays round her breasts, sticking in tufts of bluebells and campion, and in her navel he poised a pink campion flower, and in her maiden hair were forget-me-nots and woodruff. "That's you in all your glory," he said. "Lady Jane at her wedding with John Thomas." And he stuck flowers in the hair of his own body, and wound a bit of creeping jenny round his penis, and stuck a single bell of a hyacinth in his navel. She watched him with amusement, his odd intentness, and she pushed a campion flower in his moustache, where it stuck, dangling under his nose. "This is John Thomas marrying Lady Jane," he said, "and we mun let Constance and Oliver go their ways, maybe." He spread out his hand with a gesture, and then he sneezed, sneezing away the flowers from his nose and his navel. He sneezed again. "Maybe what?" she said, waiting for him to go on. He looked at her a little bewildered. "Eh?" he said. "Maybe what? Go on with what you were going to say," she insisted. What was I going to say?" He had forgotten, and it was one of the disappointments of her life that he never finished. A yellow ray of sun shone over the trees. "Sun," he said, "and time you went. Time, my lady, time. What's that as flies without wings, your ladyship? Time. Time." He reached for his shirt. "Say good night to John Thomas," he said, looking down at his penis. "He's safe in the arms of creeping Jenny. Not much burning pestle about him just now." And he put his flannel shirt over his head. "A man's most dangerous moment," he said, when his head had emerged, "is when he's getting into his shirt. Then he puts his head in a bag. That's why I prefer those American shirts that you put on like a jacket." She still stood watching him. He stepped into his short drawers and buttoned them round his waist. "Look at Jane," he said, "in all her blossoms. Who'll put blossoms on you next year, Ginny? Me or somebody else? Goodbye, my bluebell. Farewell to you. I hate that song, it's early war days. He then sat down and was pulling on his stockings. She stood unmoving. He laid his hand on the slope of her buttocks. Pretty little Lady Jane, he said. Perhaps in Venice you'll find a man who'll put jasmine in your maiden hair and a pomegranate flower in your navel. Poor little Lady Jane. Don't say those things, she said. You only say them to hurt me. He dropped his head. Then he said in dialect, Aye, maybe I do. Maybe I do. Well then, I'll say nowt and ha' done wi't. But the mun dress thy son. All go back to thy stately homes of England. How beautiful they stand. Time's up for Sir John and for little Lady Jane. Put the shimmy on, Lady Chatterley. There might be anybody standing there, be out in even a shimmy, and a few rags of flowers. There, then, I'll undress thee, the bob-tailed young throstle. And he took the leaves from her hair, kissing her damp hair, and the flowers from her breasts, and kissed her breasts, and kissed her navel, and kissed her maiden hair where he left the flowers threaded. They mun stop when they will, he said, so. There, thou'rt bare again. Nowt but a bare-assed lass and a bit of a Lady Jane. Now put thy shimmy on, for they mun go, or else Lady Chatterley's going to be late for dinner. And where have you been to, my pretty maid? She never knew how to answer him when he was in this condition of the vernacular. So she dressed herself, and prepared to go a little ignominiously home to Ragby. Or so she felt it, a little ignominiously home. He would accompany her to the broad riding. His young pheasants were all right under the shelter. When he and she came out onto the riding, there was Mrs. Bolton faltering palely towards them. Oh, me lady, we wondered if anything had happened. No, nothing has happened. Mrs. Bolton looked into the man's face. That was smooth and new-looking with love. She met his half-laughing, half-mocking eyes. He always laughed at mischance. But he looked at her kindly. Evening, Mrs. Bolton. Your ladyship will be all right now, so I can leave you. Good night to your ladyship. Good night, Mrs. Bolton. He saluted and turned away.